Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Foundation of Steel. Richard Case had always believed that loyalty was earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering dedication. At 45, he had built his life like a fortress, methodical, uncompromising, and designed to last. His hands, scarred from years of emergency medical work, told the story of a man who had clawed his way from the projects of Detroit to becoming one of the most respected trauma surgeons at Metro General Hospital. The son of a factory worker who died from lung disease at 52 and a mother who cleaned offices until her arthritis made it impossible, Richard learned early that the world owed him nothing. Every achievement had been seized through sheer will. Medical school on scholarships and loans, residency working 100-hour weeks, fellowship while supporting his young family, each step carved from stone with his bare hands. Karen Crawford had entered his life during his final year of residency. She was a nursing student then, bright-eyed and ambitious, claiming she wanted to work in pediatric oncology to make a difference. Richard saw something familiar in her hunger, or so he thought. She came from suburban comfort, her father a successful insurance agent, her mother a stay-at-home socialite. But Karen spoke passionately about helping sick children, about building a life of purpose. They married 2 years later in a simple ceremony. Richard's mother, dying of the same lung disease that claimed his father, gave him her wedding ring from the pawn shop. "Your father bought this with 3 months of overtime," she wheezed from her hospital bed. "Make it count, son." Karen seemed to understand his drive, his need to prove that a poor kid from the streets could build something lasting. When their son Doug was born, Richard held the wrinkled infant and made a silent promise that this child would never know hunger, never feel the shame of worn clothes or empty fridges. But success, Richard would learn, was a dangerous thing. As his reputation grew and the money followed, Karen's pediatric dreams faded. She took a part-time position at a private clinic, then stopped working altogether. The woman who once stayed up all night studying anatomy now spent her days at the country club, lunch dates with other doctors' wives, and shopping expeditions that Richard funded without question. Doug grew up privileged but soft. Richard tried to instill his work ethic in the boy, bringing him to volunteer at free clinics, teaching him the value of earning what you received. But Karen undermined these lessons, slipping Doug money whenever Richard demanded he work for his allowance, buying him cars and gadgets to avoid the scenes Richard's discipline caused. "You're too hard on him," Karen would say, her voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who had never known real struggle. "He's just a kid. Let him enjoy his childhood." Richard bit his tongue, remembering his own childhood, government cheese, hand-me-down clothes, watching his father cough blood into a rag he couldn't afford to replace. He worked longer hours, took on more surgeries, told himself that providing for his family was his highest calling. The warning signs were there, invisible to a man who had trained himself to see only solutions, not problems. Karen's late nights became frequent, her explanations vague. She joined a yoga studio, then a book club, then started volunteering at various charities that seemed to require an unusual number of evening commitments. Doug, now 19, and in his sophomore year at an expensive private college Richard was funding, grew increasingly hostile during his visits home. The young man who once looked up to his father now treated him with barely concealed contempt, parroting phrases about toxic masculinity and patriarchal oppression that Richard recognized as academic jargon designed to disguise disrespect. "Dad, you need to evolve," Doug had said during Christmas dinner 6 months ago, his voice carrying Karen's condescending tone. "The world isn't about grinding yourself into the ground anymore. People are realizing there's more to life than work and money." Richard had looked at his son, soft hands that had never known real labor, expensive clothes bought with money Richard earned through 18-hour days, a college education that cost more than Richard's father made in 5 years, and felt something cold settle in his chest. But he said nothing. He never said anything. Richard Case had learned long ago that actions mattered more than words, that results spoke louder than complaints. He continued his work, continued providing, continued believing that his sacrifice meant something. The night everything changed, Richard had just finished a 17-hour surgery on a 6-year-old car accident victim. The child's parents, immigrants who spoke broken English and worked 3 jobs between them, had waited in the hallway for 12 hours, holding each other and praying in whispered Spanish. When Richard emerged to tell them their daughter would live, the father had broken down crying, gripping Richard's hands and thanking him in words Richard didn't need to understand. Driving home through the empty streets at 3 a.m., Richard felt the familiar weight of exhaustion and satisfaction. Another life saved, another family kept whole. This was why he did it. Not for the money or recognition, but for moments like these when his skills made the difference between hope and despair. The house was dark when he pulled into the driveway, which wasn't unusual. Karen had always been a light sleeper, and Richard had learned to enter quietly after late surgeries. He walked to the front door, muscle memory guiding his hand to his key ring. The key didn't fit. Richard stood in the darkness, trying to process what his hands were telling him. He tried again, thinking fatigue was making him clumsy. The key slid into the lock, but wouldn't turn. He examined his key ring under the porch light, confirming he had the right key, the same key he'd used for 15 years. Before he could process this further, the front door opened. Karen stood there in a silk robe Richard didn't recognize, her hair different, her makeup perfect despite the late hour. Behind her, Richard could see into the living room he'd furnished with overtime pay and careful saving. Sitting on his couch, wearing his favorite reading chair like a throne, was Tony Bartlett. Richard knew Tony from the hospital, a pharmaceutical sales rep with silver hair and an expensive smile who had been visiting the surgical wing for the past 2 years. Tony was the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits and drove cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries, selling medications to doctors with the smooth confidence of someone who had never doubted his own worth. "Richard," Karen said, her voice steady in a way that told him this moment had been rehearsed. "We need to talk." Richard looked at his wife, then at Tony, who raised a glass of what looked like Richard's good scotch and a mocking toast. The house Richard had bought, the furniture he'd chosen, the family he'd built, all of it suddenly felt foreign, as if he were looking through a window at someone else's life. "Talk," Richard repeated, his voice calm despite the inferno building in his chest. "We want a divorce," Karen said, still standing in the doorway like a guard. "But first, you need to pay us $26,000. Richard's surgical training kept his expression neutral even as his mind raced. "Us, Tony and I have been planning a trip to Europe," Karen continued, her tone casual, as if she were discussing the weather. "We think it would be good for everyone if you helped make that happen." Tony stood up from Richard's chair, walking over to stand beside Karen with possessive confidence. "Think of it as a transition payment," he said, his sales pitch voice grating against Richard's ears, "to help everyone move forward amicably." Richard looked at these two people, his wife and a man he'd always treated with professional courtesy, and saw something he recognized from his childhood in the projects. They had the same predatory gleam in their eyes as the dealers and hustlers who preyed on weakness, who saw kindness as vulnerability to be exploited. Before Richard could respond, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Doug appeared, wearing expensive pajamas Richard had bought him, his young face twisted with an anger that Richard had never seen directed at him before. "Or you can just get out of our lives," Doug said, his voice carrying all the entitled venom of someone who had never earned anything he possessed. "Mom and Tony don't need your toxic energy around here anymore." Richard looked at his son, the boy he'd held as an infant, taught to ride a bike, watched graduate high school with pride, and saw a stranger. Worse than a stranger. He saw someone who had taken everything Richard offered and turned it into a weapon against him. The silence stretched between them, filled with 20 years of unspoken truths. Richard thought of his parents, who had loved each other through poverty and sickness until death. He thought of the immigrant father in the hospital hallway, grateful for a surgeon who cared enough to fight for his daughter's life. He thought of every 18-hour day, every sacrifice, every time he'd chosen his family's comfort over his own. "Understood," Richard said quietly. He turned and walked away from the house he'd bought, the family he'd built, the life he'd spent 20 years creating. Behind him, he heard the door close and the lock turn. His own lock, operated by people who had decided he no longer belonged in the home he'd earned. Richard got in his car and drove to the hospital. He had an office there with a couch where he sometimes rested between surgeries. As he walked through the empty corridors, past rooms where he'd saved lives and fought death, he felt something cold and hard crystallizing in his chest. He wasn't angry. Anger was hot, messy, emotional, the response of someone who still believed in justice or fairness. What Richard felt was something else entirely. It was the same cold calculation he used in surgery, the methodical precision he applied when a patient's life hung in the balance. Karen, Tony, and Doug had made a mistake. They had assumed that because Richard was decent, he was weak. They had confused his generosity with naivety, his love with stupidity. They thought they could discard him like a used surgical glove and expect him to walk away quietly. They were about to learn the difference between a man who chose restraint and a man who was incapable of retaliation. Richard Case had built everything he owned through relentless will and absolute dedication. What he could build, he could also destroy, and he had learned something in the projects that his comfortable family had forgotten. When you have nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous person in the room. Chapter 2. The Key That Wouldn't Turn. Richard spent the next 18 hours at the hospital, moving through his surgical schedule with mechanical precision. His colleagues noticed nothing unusual. Richard had always been focused, professional, unflappable. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, like tectonic plates realigning before an earthquake. Between surgeries, he made calls. His banker, his lawyer, his accountant. Conversations conducted in the same calm voice he used to deliver difficult diagnoses to families. Richard had always been methodical about his finances, keeping detailed records, planning for every contingency. Now that preparation would serve a different purpose. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, his surgical partner and the closest thing he had to a friend, found him in his office at 6 p.m., still wearing scrubs from his last operation. "Rough night?" she asked, noting the fresh clothes on his couch and the fact that he hadn't gone home. "Something like that," Richard replied, not looking up from the legal documents he was reviewing. Elena was one of the few people who understood Richard's background. She had grown up in similar circumstances, daughter of migrant workers who had fought for every opportunity. Unlike Richard, she had never married, never trusted anyone enough to share the wealth she'd built. "Karen?" Elena asked, her tone careful. Richard looked up, meeting her eyes. Elena saw something there that made her take a step back. Not fear, but recognition. She was looking at the same cold determination that had driven them both out of poverty, but pointed in a direction she'd never seen before. "What do you need?" she asked simply. "Coverage for the next few weeks," Richard said. "I'm going to be handling some personal matters." Elena nodded without asking for details. In surgery, you learn to trust your partner's judgment completely. Consider it done. Richard went home that evening. Not to the house where he'd been locked out, but to a downtown apartment he maintained near the hospital for late-night emergencies. It was sparse, functional, containing only what he needed for work. As he sat in the single chair, looking out at the city lights, he began to plan. The next morning, he returned to the house. This time, he came prepared. Karen answered the door, looking irritated at being disturbed. She wore workout clothes that probably cost more than some people's rent, her hair pulled back in a style that required professional maintenance. "Richard," we agreed. "No," Richard interrupted, his voice calm. "You spoke. I listened. Now I'm responding." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $26,000, drawn on an account she didn't know existed. Karen's eyes widened as she looked at the amount. "Thank you," she said, her tone shifting to something almost conciliatory. "I knew you'd understand. This is better for everyone." Richard nodded. "There's also this." He handed her a second envelope. This one contained divorce papers, already filled out and requiring only her signature. Karen flipped through them quickly, her expression growing confident as she saw the generous settlement terms. The house, half his retirement accounts, substantial alimony. "You're being very reasonable about this," she said, her tone now almost warm. I've always been reasonable, Richard replied. Perhaps too reasonable. Tony appeared behind Karen, fully dressed despite it being barely 8 a.m. He extended his hand to Richard with the casual confidence of a man who believed he'd won. No hard feelings, Doc, Tony said, his smile practiced and hollow. Sometimes these things just happen. Richard looked at the extended hand for a long moment, then back at Tony's face. He didn't take the hand. Indeed they do, Richard said quietly. Doug emerged from the kitchen, eating cereal from a bowl Richard had bought for him years ago. The young man looked at his father with undisguised contempt. About time you accepted reality, Doug said, his tone carrying all the cruel dismissiveness of youth. Maybe now you can find someone who actually appreciates your workaholic lifestyle. Richard studied his son, this person he had raised, educated, provided for, and saw clearly what he had created. Doug had never known struggle, never faced real consequences, never learned that actions had prices that couldn't be paid by someone else. I wanted to tell you all something, Richard said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used in the operating room. I'm taking some time off work. A sabbatical, if you will. Karen's expression flickered with something that might have been concern. That's good. You work too much anyway. I've realized I've been focused on the wrong things, Richard continued. Building, providing, maintaining. But I've neglected something important. Tony's smile faltered slightly. What's that? Richard looked at each of them in turn. His wife, her lover, his son. 3 people who had taken everything he offered and decided it wasn't enough. Teaching, Richard said simply. I've realized there are lessons I should have taught long ago. The silence that followed was broken by Karen's nervous laugh. Well, that's cryptic. Anyway, Tony and I have a flight to catch next week. The Europe trip, remember? Richard nodded. 26,000 should cover it nicely. First-class accommodations, I assume. Actually, Tony said, his sales instincts kicking in, we were thinking of extending the trip. Maybe making it 6 weeks instead of 3. See more of the continent. Ambitious, Richard said. I hope you've done your research. Europe can be challenging for unprepared travelers. Something in his tone made Karen look at him more carefully. What do you mean? Richard smiled for the first time since arriving. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Nothing specific. Just that sometimes people find themselves in situations they're not equipped to handle. Language barriers, cultural differences, unfamiliar legal systems. The kind of problems that money can't always solve. Tony's confidence wavered. Are you threatening us? Threatening. Richard's voice carried genuine surprise. I'm a surgeon, Tony. I save lives for a living. I'm simply observing that travel can be unpredictable. Richard turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Doug, I made some changes to your college funding arrangements. Nothing drastic, just shifting to a performance-based system. Your grades will determine your allowance going forward. Doug's face darkened. You can't do that. Mom, your mother is welcome to fund your education herself, Richard said mildly. I'm sure her new lifestyle will accommodate that expense. Karen's face went pale as the financial implications hit her. Richard, you can't just. I can do whatever I choose with money I earn, Richard replied. Just as you can do whatever you choose with the choices you make. He left them standing in the doorway of the house he'd bought, holding the money he'd given them, beginning to realize that Richard Case wasn't going to disappear quietly into whatever corner they'd imagined for him. Richard drove back to his apartment and began phase 2 of his plan. He opened his laptop and started making calls to contacts he'd cultivated over 20 years of medical practice. Lawyers, private investigators, forensic accountants, professionals who understood that sometimes justice required tools the law couldn't provide. By evening, he had a team assembled. People who worked in the shadows of legitimate business, who understood that wealthy men sometimes needed problems solved discreetly. Richard had never needed their services before, but he'd always been careful to maintain relationships with people whose skills might prove valuable. The next morning brought the first response to his planning. Karen called his cell phone at 6 a.m., her voice tight with panic. Richard, there's something wrong with my credit cards. They're all being declined. That's odd, Richard said, though he was unsurprised. One of his first calls had been to his credit card companies, canceling all accounts where Karen was an authorized user. Perfectly legal, completely within his rights, as the primary account holder. How am I supposed to pay for anything? Karen demanded. The same way most people do, Richard replied. With money you earn or savings you've accumulated. I don't have access to cash right now. You have $26,000, Richard pointed out. That should cover immediate expenses. That's for the Europe trip. Then I suppose you'll need to choose between immediate necessities and future travel, Richard said calmly. Unless, of course, Tony has resources of his own to contribute. The silence on the other end told Richard everything he needed to know about Tony's financial situation. Pharmaceutical sales paid well, but Tony's lifestyle suggested he spent every dollar he made on maintaining his image. This is petty, Richard, Karen said, her voice now pleading. We agreed to be civilized about this. I'm being completely civilized, Richard replied. I'm simply adjusting my spending priorities. Surely you understand that my resources should support my priorities, not yours. Karen hung up without another word. That afternoon, Doug called with similar complaints. His credit cards, his car insurance, his cell phone plan, all canceled. All things Richard had been paying for that were registered in Doug's name. You can't just cut me off, Doug shouted into the phone. I can, and I have, Richard said simply. You're 19 years old. Most people your age support themselves. I'm in college. Then perhaps you should consider how college gets funded, Richard replied. Student loans are available, as are part-time jobs. I put myself through medical school working in restaurants and warehouses. I'm sure you'll find a way. Mom said you're being psycho about this divorce. Richard paused, considering his response. I'm not being psycho, Doug. I'm being precise. There's a difference, though I understand it might be difficult for you to recognize. That evening, Richard received a visit from Tony. The pharmaceutical rep arrived at Richard's apartment building, somehow having obtained the address, and convinced the doorman to let him up. When Richard answered his door, Tony looked haggard, his usual polish replaced by desperate anxiety. We need to talk, Tony said, pushing past Richard into the sparse apartment. About what? Richard asked, closing the door. About what you're doing to Karen, Tony said, turning to face him. This passive-aggressive bullshit needs to stop. Richard studied Tony's face. The weak chin, the calculated smile, now replaced by genuine worry. The expensive clothes that couldn't hide the soft body of a man who had never faced real adversity. I'm not doing anything to Karen, Richard said quietly. I'm simply withdrawing my support. There's a difference. You know she depends on you financially. Then perhaps she should have considered that before deciding she no longer wanted to be married to me, Richard replied. Actions have consequences, Tony. Surely a successful businessman like yourself understands that principle. Tony's composure cracked further. Look, maybe we moved too fast. Maybe Karen and I could postpone the Europe trip, give everyone time to adjust. No, Richard interrupted. You should definitely take the trip. In fact, I insist on it. Something in Richard's tone made Tony step backward. What do you mean? Richard smiled, the same cold expression he'd shown at the house. I think Europe will be very educational for both of you. An opportunity to learn things about yourselves you might not discover otherwise. Are you threatening me? Tony asked, echoing his question from the day before. I'm encouraging you to follow through on your plans, Richard said. After all, you've invested considerable effort in arranging this relationship. It would be a shame not to see it through to its natural conclusion. Tony left without another word, but Richard could see the fear beginning to take root. Good. Fear was a teacher, and Tony Bartlett had many lessons ahead of him. Richard returned to his laptop and continued his work. Phase 2 was proceeding exactly as planned. But Phase 3 would require more sophisticated tools, and for that, he needed to call on some very special favors. The reckoning was just beginning. Chapter 3, The Letter of Reckoning. Richard spent the next 3 days in preparation, working with a methodical precision that had made him one of the country's finest trauma surgeons. But instead of saving lives, he was planning their systematic destruction. His first stop was downtown, in a district where legitimate businesses operated alongside services that existed in legal gray areas. The office of Marcus Webb, private investigator, occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. Webb was a former Detroit police detective who had developed a specialized practice serving wealthy clients with delicate problems. Dr. Case, Webb said, rising from behind a desk covered in surveillance photos and legal documents. Elena Rodriguez said you might need my services. Webb was a lean man in his 50s, with the watchful eyes of someone who had seen enough human weakness to surprise him. He dressed well, but not expensively, cultivated to blend into backgrounds while observing everything. I need comprehensive background investigations on 3 individuals, Richard said, placing a folder on Webb's desk. Financial records, employment history, legal issues, personal relationships, medical records where accessible. I want to know everything. Webb opened the folder and glanced at the names. Karen Crawford, Tony Bartlett, Doug Case. His expression didn't change, but Richard caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Your family, Webb observed. Former family, Richard corrected. How quickly can you work? Depends how deep you want me to go, Webb replied. Surface level a week. Complete psychological and financial profiles, 3 to 4 weeks. I have time, Richard said, but I need it done quietly. No contact with the subjects, no electronic traces they could discover. Webb nodded. My specialty. There will be expenses, court records, database access, surveillance equipment. Richard placed a cashier's check on the desk. $50,000. Webb's eyebrows rose slightly. That should cover expenses, Richard said, and ensure priority attention. Webb pocketed the check. Consider it done. Richard's next stop was even more discreet. The law offices of Morrison & Associates occupied an entire floor of a downtown high-rise, their client list reading like a who's who of Detroit's most powerful families. Janet Morrison herself was a legend in legal circles, a woman who had built her practice on the premise that every problem had a solution if you were willing to pay for the right kind of expertise. Morrison was in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She received Richard in her corner office overlooking the Detroit River, her manner suggesting this was not her first conversation with a wealthy man seeking unconventional solutions. Dr. Case, she said, gesturing to a leather chair. Elena Rodriguez speaks very highly of you. She mentioned you might need specialized legal advice. I need to understand the boundaries of what's possible, Richard said. Within the law, but utilizing every available option. Morrison smiled. My favorite kind of case. What are we dealing with? Richard outlined the situation in clinical terms. The affair, the demand for money, the son's betrayal, the need for consequences that would be both legal and comprehensive. Revenge through litigation, Morrison mused. It's an art form, really. The key is using the legal system as a scalpel rather than a hammer. I want them to understand that actions have prices, Richard said. Prices that compound over time. Oh, Dr. Case, Morrison said, her smile widening. I think we're going to work very well together. They spent 2 hours discussing strategies. Morrison's approach was elegant in its brutality, using tax law, contract obligations, and civil procedures to create cascading legal problems that would consume time, money, and peace of mind. The beauty of this approach, Morrison explained, is that it's completely legal, but it creates the kind of sustained pressure that most people aren't equipped to handle. Like water torture, but with filing deadlines and court appearances. Richard left Morrison's office with a preliminary plan that would take months to fully implement, but would begin affecting his targets immediately. The legal system, he was learning, could be a wonderfully efficient weapon when wielded by someone who understood its nuances. That evening, Richard returned to his apartment and composed a letter. He wrote it by hand, using a fountain pen his mother had given him when he graduated medical school. The paper was expensive, cream-colored with his personal letterhead embossed at the top. The letter was addressed to Karen, but intended for all 3 of them. He wrote it carefully, each word chosen with surgical precision. Karen, by the time you read this, you will have discovered the first phase of adjustments to our relationship. The financial changes are not punitive. They are educational. You have chosen to end our marriage and build a new life with Tony. I respect that choice and support your right to make it. However, choices have costs, and costs have consequences. You have lived for 20 years supported by income you did not earn, in a lifestyle you did not build, with resources you did not create. Now you'll have the opportunity to discover what your choices are worth when they stand on their own merit. Doug, I know you will read this as well. You have decided that your father's toxic energy is unwelcome in your life. I accept that decision. You are now free to build your life using your own energy, resources, and determination. I am confident this will be a valuable learning experience. Tony, you have successfully acquired a woman and a lifestyle that previously belonged to another man. Congratulations. You now have the responsibility for maintaining both. I trust your pharmaceutical sales skills will prove adequate to the challenge. I want you all to understand something important. This is not anger. Anger is emotional, temporary, and ultimately forgiving. This is precision. It is calculated, permanent, and absolute. You made a simple error in judgment. You confused my willingness to provide for my family with weakness. You mistook my love for stupidity. You assumed that because I worked hard to build something, I would be unwilling to destroy it when it was taken from me. You were wrong. Over the coming weeks and months, you will discover the difference between someone who chooses restraint and someone who is incapable of retaliation. You will learn that everything you thought you knew about Richard Case was the version of myself I showed you when I believed you were worth protecting. You will also learn that a man who can perform 17-hour surgeries has considerable stamina for sustained effort. A man who can make life or death decisions under pressure is comfortable with permanent consequences. A man who grew up in poverty understands how quickly comfort can disappear. I am not taking revenge against you. I am simply removing the shields I provided and allowing you to experience the natural consequences of your choices. What happens next will be entirely the result of your own actions and decisions. Do not attempt to negotiate with me. Do not ask for mercy or understanding. Do not expect forgiveness or reconciliation. Those possibilities ended the moment you asked me to pay for your vacation with your lover. You wanted me out of your lives. Your wish is granted. You wanted to discover who you are without my support. That discovery begins now. You wanted freedom from my expectations and standards. You now have complete freedom to meet your own. I suggest you use your trip to Europe wisely. It may be the last luxury vacation you experience for quite some time. Respectfully, Richard Case. P.S. Doug, your final grades will determine whether your tuition for next semester is paid. I suggest you study hard. Your new stepfather's income may not cover the shortfall. Richard sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote Karen's name across the front in his careful handwriting. He would deliver it tomorrow morning, just before their scheduled departure for Europe. Then he returned to his computer and began phase 3 of his plan. Webb's initial research was already yielding interesting results. Tony Bartlett, it seemed, had a more complicated financial situation than his appearance suggested. Karen's spending patterns showed a woman who had never learned to distinguish between wants and needs. Doug's academic performance was mediocre despite attending an expensive school. All useful information, all leverage points that could be exploited with the right pressure applied at the right time. Richard worked until dawn, cross-referencing data, building profiles, constructing a matrix of vulnerabilities that could be activated in sequence. By the time the sun rose over Detroit, he had a comprehensive battle plan that would unfold over the next 6 months. Phase 1 had been financial, removing his support and forcing them to face their actual resources. Phase 2 would be legal, using Morrison's expertise to create sustained pressure through legitimate channels. Phase 3 would be psychological, systematic isolation, and social consequences that would compound over time. Phase 4 would be personal, direct confrontation when they were weakened and vulnerable. Richard showered, dressed in one of his best suits, and drove to the house where he'd lived for 15 years. Karen's car was in the driveway, packed with expensive luggage for the European vacation. Tony's BMW sat beside it, equally loaded with bags and golf clubs. Richard knocked on the front door of his former home. When Karen answered, she looked surprised to see him, but not particularly concerned. She was dressed for travel in clothes that probably cost more than many people's monthly salary. "Richard," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "We're just leaving for the airport." "I know," Richard said, handing her the envelope. "I wanted to give you this before you left." Karen took the letter, her expression puzzled. "What is it?" "A farewell note," Richard said simply. "Something to read on the plane?" Tony appeared behind Karen, checking his expensive watch with irritated impatience. "We need to leave in 10 minutes or we'll miss our flight." "Of course," Richard said. "Don't let me delay you." Doug emerged from the house, carrying the last of the luggage. He looked at his father with the same contempt as before, but Richard noticed something new in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty. "See you around, Dad," Doug said, his tone attempting casualness but missing the mark. "Yes," Richard replied quietly. "You will." The three of them loaded into Tony's BMW and pulled out of the driveway. Richard watched them leave, then walked to his car and followed at a distance. He wanted to be sure they actually boarded the plane. At the airport, Richard watched from the departure lounge as Karen opened his letter. He was too far away to hear her reaction, but he could see her face go pale as she read. She showed the letter to Tony, whose expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Doug read it over their shoulders, his young face contorting with anger. They looked around the terminal as if searching for Richard, but he had positioned himself where he could observe without being seen. After several minutes of heated discussion, they proceeded to their gate. Richard remained until he saw their plane taxi away from the terminal. They were gone. Phase 1 was complete. Richard drove back to his apartment and opened his laptop. Webb had sent an encrypted email with preliminary findings. Morrison had filed the first series of legal documents. The investigation and litigation phases were beginning. Richard poured himself a glass of the good scotch. The bottle Tony had been drinking from was a cheap decoy he'd left at the house for exactly this kind of discovery, and settled in to review the incoming intelligence. The war had begun in earnest. Karen, Tony, and Doug had fired the opening shot when they demanded payment for their betrayal. Now, they would learn what happened when you attack someone who had spent his entire life fighting for everything he owned. Richard Case had been their protector, their provider, their shield against the harsh realities of the world. Now he would be their teacher, and the lessons he planned to deliver would be thorough, comprehensive, and permanent. The key that wouldn't fit had unlocked something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Chapter 4. The Art of Pressure. 3 days into Karen and Tony's European vacation, Richard received the first reports from his surveillance team. The couple had arrived in London as planned, checked into an expensive hotel in Kensington, and immediately begun the kind of extravagant spending that suggested they viewed the trip as a celebration of their victory over the foolish husband they'd left behind. Richard studied the photographs Webb's contact had provided. Karen and Tony dining at Michelin-starred restaurants, shopping on Bond Street, taking private tours of landmarks. They looked relaxed, happy, convinced they had successfully discarded the burden of Richard's presence from their lives. They had no idea that their every move was being documented, their every purchase tracked, their every conversation in public spaces monitored by professionals who specialized in making the invisible visible. Phase 1 of their education begins today, Richard said to Janet Morrison as they met in her office to review the legal filings. Morrison spread a series of documents across her mahogany conference table like a general planning a campaign. "I've initiated 5 separate civil actions," she explained, her voice carrying the satisfaction of an artist discussing her work. "Each one is perfectly legitimate, but collectively they create a web of legal obligations that will consume significant time and resources." The first filing was a dispute over the division of marital assets, challenging Karen's entitlement to the house based on her abandonment of the marriage. The second was a forensic accounting demand, requiring detailed documentation of every penny spent during the last 2 years of their marriage. The third was a challenge to Doug's emergency access to his college funds, freezing the accounts pending investigation of potential misuse. "The beauty of this approach," Morrison continued, "is that each action requires immediate attention but takes months to resolve. They'll need legal representation, document production, court appearances, all while trying to enjoy their new freedom." Richard examined the paperwork with the same attention he gave to surgical plans. Timeline for first responses? They'll start receiving service while they're still in Europe, Morrison said with evident pleasure. Imagine trying to enjoy the Louvre while knowing you need to respond to 5 separate lawsuits within 30 days. Richard's phone buzzed with a message from Webb. The first phase of financial pressure was already showing results. Tony's credit cards were being declined at increasingly frequent intervals, forcing him to rely on cash advances that carried punitive interest rates. Karen had attempted to use her emergency credit card, the one Richard had forgotten to cancel, only to discover its limit had been reduced to $500. Excellent, Richard said, reviewing the financial intelligence. They're beginning to understand the difference between spending someone else's money and managing their own resources. That afternoon, Richard turned his attention to Doug's situation. His son had returned to college after the European departure, apparently assuming that his father's threats about performance-based funding were empty posturing. Doug's first semester grades had arrived that morning, a collection of C's and D's that represented exactly the kind of mediocre effort Richard had feared. Richard called the registrar's office at Doug's expensive private college and spoke to Mrs. Henderson, the woman who handled tuition payments for the school's wealthiest families. "Dr. Case," she said warmly, "how can I help you today?" "I need to discuss my son's account," Richard said. "I'm implementing some changes to the funding structure." Mrs. Henderson's tone became more cautious. "What kind of changes?" "Doug's tuition for next semester will be contingent on his final GPA for this term," Richard explained. "If he achieves a 3.5 or higher, I'll pay in full. Below that, he'll need to arrange alternative funding." "Dr. Case," Mrs. Henderson said carefully, "students typically need advance notice for such arrangements. There are deadlines for financial aid applications, scholarship competitions. Then I suggest Doug uses his remaining time this semester wisely," Richard replied. "I'm confident he can achieve the necessary grades if he applies himself." After ending the call, Richard sent Doug an email with the new academic requirements. The message was brief and businesslike, copying the same tone Doug had used when dismissing his father as irrelevant to his life. By evening, Richard had received 3 panicked phone calls from Doug, each more desperate than the last. The young man who had stood in the hallway demanding his father leave their lives was now begging for flexibility, understanding, a second chance. Richard declined all calls and responded with a single text message. "Your grades will speak for themselves. Actions, not words, determine outcomes." That night, Richard received an encrypted report from his European surveillance team. Karen and Tony had experienced their first taste of financial reality that evening when their dinner bill at an exclusive restaurant was declined by Tony's primary credit card. After 20 minutes of embarrassing negotiations with the manager, Tony had been forced to call his bank from the restaurant to arrange an emergency wire transfer. The photographs showed Karen's face during this incident, her expression shifting from confusion to embarrassment to something approaching fear. She was beginning to understand that the comfortable financial cushion she'd taken for granted might not be as secure as she'd assumed. Richard studied the images with the same detached analysis he used to examine surgical x-rays. Karen and Tony were starting to experience stress, uncertainty, the first hints of consequences for their choices. But this was merely the beginning of their education. The next morning brought Richard's first direct communication from the European front. Karen called the cell phone at 3 a.m. Detroit time, which meant it was 9 a.m. in London, early enough that she'd probably been awake all night worrying. "Richard," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic, "we need to talk." "Do we?" Richard replied, his tone politely interested. "These legal papers," Karen continued. "This is insane. I have lawyers in London demanding I appear in Detroit courts next week. How am I supposed to handle this from Europe?" "Carefully," Richard suggested. "I imagine international legal coordination requires considerable planning and expense." "You can't be serious about this," Karen said, her voice rising. "These lawsuits are frivolous. No judge will." "On the contrary," Richard interrupted gently. "Each filing addresses legitimate concerns about asset division, financial accountability, and parental obligations. Any competent attorney will confirm that these are serious legal matters requiring serious attention." The silence on the international line stretched long enough that Richard wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Karen spoke again, her voice smaller. "What do you want, Richard?" "Want?" Richard repeated, as if the question confused him. "I want you to enjoy your vacation, Karen. I want you to experience the freedom you chose. I want you to discover who you are when you're standing on your own merit instead of on the foundation I built." "This isn't fair," Karen said, her voice breaking slightly. "Fair?" Richard's tone remained calm, conversational. "You decided our 20-year marriage was worth $26,000. You demanded payment from a man you betrayed to fund a vacation with your lover. You enlisted our son to deliver ultimatums in his own home. But you're concerned about fairness?" Karen began to cry. Not the manipulative tears Richard had seen during arguments, but the genuine desperation of someone who was beginning to understand the scope of their miscalculation. "I never meant for things to go this far," she said through her sobs. "Yes, you did," Richard replied quietly. "You meant exactly this. You wanted me out of your life so you could build a new one with Tony. You wanted freedom from my expectations, my standards, my presence. You wanted to discover what your choices were worth without my support. You're getting exactly what you asked for." Richard ended the call and returned to his laptop. Webb had sent overnight intelligence showing that Tony had spent the morning making increasingly frantic calls to his bank, his credit card companies, and what appeared to be a high-interest loan service. The pharmaceutical rep who had projected such confidence was discovering that his actual financial resources were significantly more limited than his carefully cultivated image suggested. Meanwhile, Doug had apparently attempted to negotiate with his college administration, tried to arrange payment deferrals and emergency funding. Mrs. Henderson had politely referred him to the financial aid office, where he would discover that his family's income level disqualified him from most assistance programs. Richard spent the morning reviewing Morrison's legal timeline. The pressure would intensify over the next 2 weeks as deadlines approached, and the true cost of mounting a comprehensive legal defense became clear. Karen and Tony would be forced to choose between cutting their vacation short to return for legal proceedings or hiring expensive international attorneys to represent them in absentia. Either choice would consume resources they were discovering they didn't actually possess. Richard's phone rang again that afternoon. This time it was Tony, his sales professional voice strained with barely controlled anxiety. "Dr. Case," Tony said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "About what?" Richard asked politely. "About the legal situation," Tony continued. "These lawsuits, they're affecting Karen's ability to enjoy our trip. Surely we can work something out." "I'm afraid I don't understand," Richard said. "What aspect of the legal proceedings would you like me to explain?" Tony's composure cracked slightly. "Look, maybe we moved too fast with the divorce talk. Maybe Karen and I could postpone our plans, give everyone time to cool down." "No," Richard interrupted. "You were quite clear about wanting me out of your lives. I respect that decision. These legal matters are simply the natural consequence of dissolving a 20-year marriage. Surely a successful businessman like yourself, anticipated that divorce would involve legal proceedings." "This isn't about the divorce," Tony said, his voice rising. "This is about you using the courts to harass us because your feelings are hurt." Richard was quiet for a long moment, letting Tony's words hang in the air. "Mr. Bartlett," Richard said finally, his voice carrying the cold precision of a scalpel, "my feelings are irrelevant. These are business matters, asset division, financial accountability, parental obligations. If you're unable to handle the business aspects of the choices you've made, perhaps you should reconsider whether you're equipped for the responsibilities you've assumed." Tony hung up without another word. That evening, Richard received confirmation that Karen and Tony had attempted to extend their stay in London, but were unable to secure additional credit for hotel expenses. They had been forced to move to significantly cheaper accommodations and were cutting their trip short by a week. The education was proceeding exactly as planned. They were learning that actions had costs, that costs had consequences, and that some consequences couldn't be avoided by charm, negotiation, or emotional appeals. But this was still just the beginning. Richard Case had spent his entire life building things methodically, patiently, with absolute attention to detail. He was applying those same skills to destruction, and he had barely started to show them what he was truly capable of when his restraint was removed. Phase 2 was about to begin, and it would be considerably more educational than anything they had experienced so far. Chapter 5. The European Lesson. Web surveillance team reported that Karen and Tony had been forced to move to a youth hostel in London, a dramatic fall from the luxury hotel where they'd started their celebration vacation. The photographs told a story of two people discovering that $26,000 disappeared much faster when you weren't accustomed to managing your own expenses. Richard studied the images with clinical interest. Karen looked haggard, her usually perfect appearance showing the strain of 3 days trying to manage a crisis from 3,000 miles away. Tony appeared even worse, his expensive clothes wrinkled, his confident smile replaced by the hollow stare of a man watching his carefully constructed image collapse in real time. "They're learning," Richard said to Elena Rodriguez as they reviewed surgical schedules in his office. "The difference between spending someone else's money and managing your own resources." Elena glanced at the surveillance photos Richard had left open on his desk. As his closest colleague, she was one of the few people who knew the full scope of what Richard was implementing. "Are you sure you want to see this through to the end?" she asked quietly. "There's still time to pull back before it becomes irreversible." Richard looked up from the patient charts they were reviewing. "Elena, when you're operating on a patient with aggressive cancer, do you stop cutting when you've removed half the tumor?" "No," she replied. "But this isn't surgery, Richard. These are people." "Yes," Richard said quietly. "People who decided that 20 years of my life, my work, my dedication was worth $26,000 and a demand that I disappear from their lives. People who enlisted my own son to deliver ultimatums in the home I built for him." Elena studied his face and saw something she recognized from their most difficult surgeries: complete, unwavering focus on the outcome that had to be achieved, regardless of how painful the process might be. "I've seen you save people who didn't deserve saving," she said. "This feels different." "Because it is different," Richard replied. "I'm not trying to save them. I'm teaching them that choices have consequences. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is let people experience the full weight of their decisions." That afternoon, Richard received a call from Morrison with an update on the legal proceedings. Karen had attempted to hire a London-based attorney to handle her Detroit court appearances, but the cost estimate had been so high that she'd been forced to consider returning to the United States immediately. "She's trapped," Morrison explained with evident satisfaction. "If she stays in Europe, she defaults on multiple legal proceedings. If she returns early, she loses the vacation she was so determined to take and still has to face the legal costs." "What about Tony?" Richard asked. "Even more interesting," Morrison replied. "Our forensic accountant discovered that Mr. Bartlett has been living significantly beyond his means for years. He's carrying substantial debt that he's been managing through credit manipulation and cash advances. The financial pressure from this trip appears to be pushing him toward insolvency." Richard smiled. "Perfect. Nothing teaches the value of financial stability like the experience of losing it." That evening, Richard turned his attention to Doug's increasingly desperate situation. His son had attempted every possible avenue for maintaining his college funding: appeals to administrators, emergency financial aid applications, even a tearful phone call to his grandmother, Richard's elderly mother, who lived on Social Security and could barely afford her medications. The old woman had called Richard afterward, her voice frail but concerned. "Ricky," she said, using the childhood name she'd never abandoned, "Doug says you've cut off his college money. That doesn't sound like you." Richard felt a pang of guilt, not for his actions, but for the distress they were causing his mother. She was the one person in his family who had never asked for anything beyond his presence and occasional help with medical appointments. "Mom," he said gently, "Doug and his mother decided they didn't want me in their lives anymore. They demanded I pay the money and then disappear. I'm simply respecting their wishes." His mother was quiet for a long moment. "That boy called me crying, asking for money for school. I told him I don't have money for anything except groceries and pills." "You were right to tell him that," Richard said. "Doug needs to learn the difference between wanting something and earning it. You know," his mother said slowly, "your father would have done the same thing. He never tolerated disrespect, especially from family." "But Ricky," Make sure you know when to stop. Sometimes people learn their lessons, and sometimes they just get broken. Richard considered his mother's words after ending the call. She was the only person whose opinion still mattered to him, the only one who had earned the right to question his choices. But she hadn't been locked out of her own home by people she'd loved and sacrificed for. She hadn't been told her presence was toxic by the son she'd raised. The next morning brought news from Europe that accelerated Richard's timeline considerably. Webb's team reported that Karen and Tony had been forced to cut their trip short by another week due to financial constraints. But more importantly, they had been observed having increasingly heated arguments in public spaces. The surveillance audio revealed the source of their conflict. Tony was blaming Karen for the legal and financial pressure, claiming that she had misrepresented her husband's likely response to their relationship. Karen was countering that Tony had assured her he had the resources to support their new lifestyle. "They're turning on each other," Webb reported during their evening briefing. Classic stress response. When external pressure becomes too intense, people tend to redirect blame toward their closest allies. Richard found this development particularly satisfying. Karen and Tony's relationship had been built on the fantasy that they could discard the inconvenient husband and seamlessly transition to a better life. Now, they were discovering that relationships forged in betrayal often came with inherent structural weaknesses. "How long before they return?" Richard asked. "Based on their current spending rate and the legal deadlines Morrison has created, I estimate 3 to 4 days, Webb replied. "They simply don't have the resources to stay longer." Richard nodded. "Perfect. I want comprehensive surveillance when they return. Every meeting, every conversation, every location. I need to understand their mindset when they realize the legal pressure was just the beginning." That weekend, Richard implemented phase 3 of his plan. He began systematically contacting members of their social circle, the country club crowd that Karen had cultivated during her transformation from nursing student to doctor's wife. The conversations were masterpieces of calculated revelation. Richard never directly attacked Karen or Tony. Instead, he simply shared information about his situation in the same calm, factual tone he used for patient consultations. "Janet," he said to Karen's closest friend at the country club, "I wanted you to hear this from me rather than through gossip. Karen and I are divorcing. She's moved in with Tony Bartlett, and they're currently in Europe together." Janet Morrison, not the lawyer, but a social climber who had attached herself to Karen's elevated status, was clearly shocked. "Richard, I had no idea. Karen never mentioned. I mean, she said you were having some difficulties, but I'm sure she didn't mention the details," Richard said mildly. "It's probably awkward to explain that she demanded I could pay for their vacation together." The silence on the phone was profound. Richard had just delivered the kind of social suicide bomb that would detonate throughout their entire social circle within hours. He made similar calls to other key figures in their community. The golf pro who had given Tony club privileges, the charity organizers where Karen had served on boards, the private school administrators where Doug had been groomed for elite college placement. Each conversation was carefully crafted to sound like a man trying to handle his personal crisis with dignity while inadvertently revealing details that would destroy his former family's social standing. By Sunday evening, Richard estimated that everyone in their elevated social circle knew the essential facts. Karen Case had left her successful surgeon husband for a pharmaceutical salesman, demanded payment for their European vacation, and enlisted her son in delivering ultimatums. Monday morning brought the first direct consequences of this social destruction. Karen's phone had been ringing constantly with calls from friends and acquaintances, some offering support, but most fishing for gossip. Tony had been disinvited from a golf tournament where several prominent doctors had threatened to withdraw if he participated. But the most significant development came from Doug's college. Mrs. Henderson called Richard personally to inform him that his son had been found cheating on his final examinations, apparently a desperate attempt to achieve the grades necessary for continued funding. "I'm afraid Doug has been suspended pending a disciplinary hearing," Mrs. Henderson explained. The violation was quite serious. Multiple forged documents and evidence of coordinated cheating with other students. Richard felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. What's the typical consequence for such violations? Suspension for at least 1 semester, possibly expulsion, Mrs. Henderson replied. It's particularly serious because this appears to have been premeditated rather than a moment of poor judgment. Understand, Richard said. Please proceed with whatever disciplinary action the school deems appropriate. I won't be intervening on Doug's behalf. That afternoon, Richard received his first communication from Doug in days. His son's voice message was barely coherent through tears and panic. Dad, please, I'm sorry. I made a huge mistake. They're going to kick me out. I'll do anything. Please just call me back. I can't handle this. Mom's not answering her phone. Please, Dad, I'm scared. Richard listened to the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Doug had made his choice when he stood in that hallway and demanded his father leave their lives. Now, he was learning that choices had consequences, even for privileged young men who had never faced real adversity. That evening, Webb confirmed that Karen and Tony were returning to Detroit the next day, their European vacation cut short by 2 weeks due to financial constraints and legal obligations. Their relationship had deteriorated considerably during the final days of the trip, with multiple witnesses reporting public arguments about money, responsibility, and blame. Richard spent the evening reviewing the comprehensive dossiers Webb had compiled on both of them. The intelligence was devastating. Financial records showing Tony's precarious debt situation, Karen's complete lack of practical job skills or independent income sources, and psychological profiles indicating neither was equipped to handle sustained pressure. Phase 3 had been about applying social and academic pressure while they were isolated and vulnerable. Phase 4 would involve direct confrontation when they returned, weakened and demoralized, to face the full scope of what Richard had prepared for them. Richard poured himself a glass of his good scotch and toasted the empty apartment where he now lived by choice rather than exile. Karen, Tony, and Doug had wanted him out of their lives. Tomorrow, they would begin to understand exactly what life looked like when Richard Case stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. The real education was about to begin. Chapter 6, The Reckoning Returns. Karen and Tony's flight landed at Detroit Metropolitan Airport on a gray Tuesday morning, 14 days shorter than planned, and under circumstances neither had anticipated when they departed in triumph. Webb's surveillance team was waiting, positioned to document their return and the immediate aftermath of their truncated European education. The photographs told a story of 2 people who had left as confident victors and returned as something approaching refugees. Karen's expensive luggage looked worn from hasty packing and cheap accommodations. Tony's usual polished appearance had degraded into the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 weeks watching his carefully constructed life collapse in real time. Richard studied the surveillance images from his apartment while simultaneously reviewing the legal timeline Morrison had prepared for their return. The couple would have exactly 4 hours before the first court-mandated deadline required their attention. Barely enough time to collect themselves before the full weight of Richard's legal offensive demanded response. Perfect timing, Richard murmured, noting that their flight delay had compressed their schedule even further. His phone rang at 10:47 a.m. Karen's number appeared on the display, but Richard let it go to voicemail. The message that followed was a masterpiece of exhausted desperation. Richard, we're back. We need to talk. This has gone too far. Please just call me back. We have 4 hours to respond to these court filings, and I don't even understand what they're asking for. Please call me back. Richard deleted the message without consideration. He had told them clearly that negotiation was no longer possible. They had demanded that he leave their lives. He was simply honoring that request by refusing to engage with their problems. An hour later, Tony called from a different number, probably borrowed from someone at the airport. His voice message carried the desperate intensity of a salesman trying to close a deal while the client walked away. Dr. Case, this is Tony Bartlett. Look, I think we can work this out. Karen and I have been talking, and we realize maybe we moved too fast on some things. Maybe we can find a middle ground here. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but this legal warfare isn't helping anyone. Call me back. Let's be reasonable adults about this. Richard smiled at Tony's use of the phrase reasonable adults. They had wanted to discover what life looked like without his support and protection. Experiencing the consequences of their choices was exactly the kind of adult responsibility they had claimed to want. By early afternoon, Webb's team reported that Karen and Tony had been forced to hire emergency legal representation at premium rates to handle the immediate court deadlines. The attorney they'd found specialized in crisis management for wealthy clients and charged accordingly. $500 per hour with a $10,000 retainer required up front. The photographs showed them sitting in the lawyer's office, heads in their hands, as the scope of their legal obligations was explained. They were learning that divorce from a wealthy, methodical man with unlimited legal resources was considerably more complex than they had imagined. Meanwhile, Doug had been calling Richard's office at the hospital every hour, becoming increasingly hysterical as the reality of his suspension and potential expulsion became clear. Elena Rodriguez had fielded the calls with professional courtesy, but her messages to Richard were becoming more concerned. "Richard," she said during their afternoon meeting, "your son called 6 times today? He sounds like he's having some kind of breakdown." "Probably," Richard agreed, reviewing patient charts without looking up. Young people often struggle when they experience consequences for the first time. "Maybe you should consider." "Elena," Richard interrupted gently, "you asked me earlier whether I was sure about seeing this through. The answer remains yes. Doug made his choice when he told me to get out of his life. I'm respecting that choice." Elena studied his face and saw the same unwavering focus that made him one of the finest surgeons in the country. When Richard Case decided on a course of action, he followed it through to completion regardless of how difficult the process became. That evening, Richard received intelligence that both accelerated his timeline and confirmed his psychological analysis of his targets. Web surveillance had captured Karen and Tony in a screaming match outside their emergency attorney's office, with Karen blaming Tony for underestimating Richard's likely response and Tony accusing Karen of misrepresenting her husband's character and resources. More importantly, they had been overheard discussing the possibility of cutting their losses and finding an exit strategy, language that suggested their relationship was fracturing under pressure exactly as Richard had predicted. Classic stress response, Webb explained during their evening briefing. Relationships built on convenience and fantasy rarely survive sustained pressure. They're starting to see each other as liabilities rather than assets. Richard felt a cold satisfaction. Karen and Tony had betrayed his 20-year marriage for what they'd imagined would be a better partnership. Now, they were discovering that relationships forged in betrayal often carried the seeds of their own destruction. The next morning brought the first major fracture. Webb's overnight surveillance revealed that Tony had spent the night at a hotel rather than returning to the house with Karen. Financial records showed he had also made several calls to a personal bankruptcy attorney, apparently exploring his options for escaping the legal and financial pressure. Karen, meanwhile, had been observed crying in her car outside Doug's college, where she had apparently gone to try to advocate for her son, only to be told that parental intervention was not permitted in disciplinary proceedings. The photographs showed a woman beginning to understand that the comfortable support systems she had taken for granted were no longer available. Richard's phone rang at 8:15 a.m. This time it was Doug, calling from what sounded like a payphone based on the background noise. "Dad," Doug said, his voice breaking with tears and exhaustion. "Please, I'm begging you. I can't handle this anymore. They're going to expel me. Mom's freaking out. Everything's falling apart. Please just talk to me." Richard listened to his son's desperation with the same clinical detachment he used to evaluate patient symptoms. Doug was experiencing the full weight of consequences for the first time in his privileged life, and the shock was considerable. "Dad, are you there? Please say something. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry I said those things. I was angry and stupid, and I didn't mean it. Please just give me another chance." Richard ended the call without responding. Doug's apology was motivated by consequences, not genuine understanding. If Richard relented now, his son would simply learn that dramatic pleading could override serious consequences. Exactly the wrong lesson. That afternoon, Morrison called with an update that pleased Richard considerably. Karen's emergency attorney had attempted to negotiate a settlement of the legal proceedings, offering to withdraw the divorce petition and return to mediation if Richard would dismiss his filings. I told them, Morrison said with evident amusement, that my client was no longer interested in preserving the marriage and that the legal proceedings would continue regardless of Mrs. Case's change of heart. What was their response? Richard asked. Panic, essentially, Morrison replied. They're beginning to understand that this isn't about the divorce anymore. This is about accountability for their choices, and accountability can't be negotiated away. That evening, Richard implemented the next phase of his plan. He called his real estate agent and instructed her to list the house where Karen was currently living. Since the property was in his name alone, purchased before their marriage with money he had earned, he had the legal right to sell it regardless of Karen's preferences. Listed aggressively, Richard instructed, I want it sold quickly, even if that means accepting a lower price. Dr. Case, the agent said carefully, doesn't your wife live there currently? My soon-to-be ex-wife is living there temporarily, Richard corrected. She'll need to make other arrangements. The listing went live that night, with a price that guaranteed immediate interest from investors. By morning, Richard's agent had already scheduled 3 showings and received 2 preliminary offers. Karen discovered the listing when neighbors began calling to ask if she was moving. Her phone call to Richard that afternoon was barely coherent through tears and rage. You can't sell the house. I live here. Where am I supposed to go? This is insane. Richard, you can't just destroy everything. Richard let the call go to voicemail, as had become his practice. Karen's message captured perfectly the mindset he was working to correct. The assumption that she had a right to continued comfort and security without any corresponding obligations or consequences for her choices. By evening, Webb reported that Karen had attempted to contact Tony for support, but discovered he had disconnected his phone and vacated his apartment. The pharmaceutical rep had apparently decided that cutting ties with Karen was his best strategy for escaping the legal and financial pressure Richard had created. Doug, meanwhile, had been found by campus security sleeping in his car in the college parking lot, apparently afraid to return home to face his mother's crisis and unable to afford alternative accommodations. The photographs Webb provided showed 3 people who had been confident victors just 3 weeks earlier, now scattered and isolated, each facing the full weight of consequences they had never imagined possible. Richard studied the images with the satisfaction of a surgeon who had successfully removed a complex tumor. The operation was proceeding exactly as planned, but it was far from complete. Karen, Tony, and Doug were learning about consequences, but they hadn't yet reached the point of genuine understanding. That would require more direct intervention, and Richard was prepared to provide exactly the kind of personal attention his former family deserved after their betrayal. Phase 4 was about to begin, and it would be considerably more educational than anything they had experienced so far. Chapter 7. Direct Contact. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday. Richard had been expecting it, had even set his phone to accept calls from unknown numbers specifically for this moment. Doug's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse from crying, shaking with exhaustion and fear. Dad, I'm at the emergency room. I think I'm having a panic attack or something. I can't breathe right, and my chest hurts, and the doctors want to call someone, but I don't know who to call because Mom isn't answering her phone, and I'm scared. Richard sat up in bed, his medical instincts immediately alert. Despite everything, Doug was still his son, and panic attacks in young adults could sometimes mask more serious cardiac issues. Which hospital? Richard asked, his voice calm and professional. Metro General, Doug said through tears. The same one where you work. I told them you were my dad, but they said you weren't on duty tonight. Richard was already getting dressed. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Ask them to run an EKG and basic blood work. Tell the attending that Dr. Case is coming in for a family consultation. Thank you, Doug whispered. Thank you, Dad, I'm so sorry. Save the apologies, Richard said quietly. Just focus on breathing slowly and letting the doctors examine you. Richard drove through the empty Detroit streets with mixed emotions. His paternal instincts were genuinely concerned about Doug's medical condition, but he also recognized this as a potential manipulation, a crisis designed to force him into resuming his protective role. When he arrived at the emergency department, he found Doug sitting on an examination table in one of the curtained areas, looking smaller and younger than Richard had seen him in years. The young man's face was pale, his eyes red from crying, his expensive clothes wrinkled and dirty. "Dr. Case," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending physician, "your son is medically stable. The EKG was normal, blood work came back clean. This appears to be a panic attack triggered by severe stress." Richard nodded, reviewing Doug's chart with professional detachment. "Has he indicated what's causing the stress?" Dr. Williams glanced at Doug, who was staring at his hands. "Academic problems, family issues, financial concerns. Fairly typical for college students, but more severe than usual." Richard approached his son's bedside and spoke in the same calm tone he used with all his patients. "Doug, look at me." Doug raised his eyes, and Richard saw genuine fear there. Not the entitled anger from before, but the terror of someone who had discovered that the world could be much harsher than he'd ever imagined. "Are you having any chest pain right now?" Richard asked. "No," Doug whispered. "Just everything feels like it's falling apart." "That's not a medical condition," Richard said quietly. "That's a life condition, and life conditions require life solutions, not medical ones." Richard turned to Dr. Williams. "He's stable for discharge. The panic attacks will continue until he addresses the underlying stressors." "Dad," Doug said desperately as Richard moved toward the curtain. "Can we talk? Please? Just for 5 minutes." Richard studied his son's face and saw something he'd never seen before: genuine humility. The entitled young man who had demanded his father leave their lives was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to understand what life looked like without protection. "5 minutes," Richard said, closing the curtain to give them privacy. Doug took a shaking breath. "I know you hate me now. I know I said terrible things. But I'm scared, Dad. I don't know how to handle any of this. They're going to kick me out of school. Mom's losing her mind. Tony disappeared, and I don't have any money or anywhere to live, and I don't know what to do." Richard sat in the plastic chair beside the examination table. "What do you think you should do?" "I don't know," Doug said, his voice cracking. "I've never had to figure this stuff out before. You always just handled everything." "Yes," Richard said quietly. "I did. For 19 years. I made sure you never had to face consequences, never had to solve real problems, never had to earn what you received. Do you understand why that was a mistake?" Doug nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Because it made me weak. Because it made you unprepared," Richard corrected. "You're not weak, Doug. You're just inexperienced. But experience can only be gained through practice, and practice requires facing real challenges with real consequences." "Does that mean you're not going to help me?" Doug asked, his voice small. Richard considered his answer carefully. This was the moment that would determine whether Doug learned genuine lessons or simply discovered new ways to manipulate his father's protective instincts. "I'm going to help you," Richard said finally, "but not in the way I used to. I'm not going to solve your problems for you. I'm not going to shield you from consequences. I'm not going to provide money or influence to make your mistakes disappear." Doug's face fell. "Then how are you going to help?" "By teaching you what I should have taught you years ago," Richard said. "How to work, how to earn, how to take responsibility for your own choices and their consequences." Richard pulled out his phone and made a call. "Marcus? It's Richard Case. I have a job for you." "No, not surveillance. I need someone to teach a young man how to work for a living." "Yes, my son. Construction, restaurant work, anything that requires showing up on time and earning your pay. Tomorrow morning." He ended the call and looked at Doug. "You'll start work tomorrow at 6 a.m. Construction cleanup for minimum wage. You'll work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Your wages will go toward paying for a room in a boarding house and basic food." "Dad," Doug said desperately, "what about school?" "What about it?" Richard replied. "You cheated on your final exams. You've been suspended pending a disciplinary hearing. School is not your immediate problem. Learning how to support yourself is. But if I don't go to college, then you'll learn a trade," Richard said simply. "Millions of people make decent livings without college degrees. They work with their hands, they solve real problems, they earn what they receive." Doug stared at his father in shock. You want me to become a construction worker? I want you to become a man, Richard replied. Construction work is just the beginning. If you prove you can show up on time, work hard, and take responsibility for your performance, we'll discuss the next step. What's the next step? Richard stood up, preparing to leave. That depends entirely on you. Show me you can handle basic employment, and we'll talk about your future options. Fail to meet even minimum standards, and you'll discover what life is like for people who can't support themselves. Doug grabbed his father's arm as he moved toward the curtain. Dad, what about Mom? She's falling apart. The house is being sold. Tony's gone. She doesn't have anywhere to go or any way to pay for anything. Richard looked down at his son's hand on his arm, then back at Doug's face. What about her? Aren't you going to help her? Help her do what? Richard asked quietly. Karen made her choice when she decided our marriage was worth $26,000. She chose to end our relationship and build a new life with Tony. I'm respecting that choice by allowing her to experience the full consequences of what she wanted. But she's your wife. No, Richard corrected. She was my wife. Now she's a woman who betrayed 20 years of marriage for a vacation with another man. There's a difference. Doug's grip tightened on Richard's arm. You're just going to let her destroy herself? Richard gently removed his son's hand from his arm. I'm not letting Karen do anything. I'm simply no longer preventing her from experiencing the natural consequences of her choices. For 20 years, I protected her from the harsh realities of the world. Now, she has the opportunity to discover what those realities look like. That's cruel, Doug whispered. No, Richard replied calmly. That's educational. Cruelty would be continuing to enable her irresponsible behavior while pretending it was kindness. Richard moved toward the exit, then paused. Doug, you asked me to help you, and I've offered exactly the kind of help you need. You can accept it and learn what it means to earn your place in the world, or you can refuse it and discover what life is like for people who expect others to solve their problems. What if I can't do it? Doug asked desperately. What if I'm not strong enough? Richard looked back at his son, this young man he'd raised in comfort and privilege, who was finally beginning to understand that the world required more than good intentions and entitlement. Then you'll get stronger, Richard said simply, or you'll fail. Either way, you'll learn something important about yourself. Richard left Doug sitting on the examination table, facing the first real choice of his adult life. The young man could accept his father's offer of genuine help, the kind that required work and growth and genuine change. Or he could refuse it and discover what independence actually meant for someone with no practical skills or experience. Either way, Doug's education in real-world consequences was about to accelerate considerably. Richard drove home through the empty streets, satisfied that Phase 4 was proceeding exactly as planned. His former family was beginning to understand that Richard Case was not the weak, exploitable man they had assumed. They were learning that when you attacked someone who had spent his entire life fighting for everything he owned, you had better be prepared for a war you couldn't win. But the real reckoning was still ahead of them. Chapter 8. The Full Circle. 3 weeks later, Richard sat in his downtown apartment reviewing reports that detailed the complete dissolution of the life he had built and protected for 20 years. The transformation was so thorough it felt almost surgical. Each element of his former family's comfortable existence systematically removed with the precision he brought to complex operations. Doug had accepted the construction job, though not without considerable struggle. Web surveillance showed the young man arriving late for his first week, earning reprimands from the foreman, sleeping in his car because he couldn't initially afford the boarding house room Richard had arranged. But gradually, painfully, Doug was learning what it meant to earn his place in the world. The photographs from his third week showed a different person, leaner, more focused, arriving at the job site 15 minutes early instead of 10 minutes late. Doug Case was discovering muscles he'd never used and capabilities he'd never needed to develop. He's adapting, Webb reported during their weekly briefing. Still struggling with the physical demands, but he stopped complaining and started asking questions about the work. Richard felt something that might have been pride if it hadn't been tempered by regret that these lessons had come so late and at such cost. Karen's situation had deteriorated more dramatically. The house sale had been finalized, leaving her with 30 days to vacate. Tony's complete disappearance had forced her to confront the reality that their relationship had been built on fantasy and mutual exploitation rather than genuine partnership. Most devastatingly, Karen had attempted to return to nursing, but discovered that her 15-year absence from the profession had left her skills obsolete and her credentials expired. The positions available to her required extensive retraining and offered starting salaries that wouldn't support the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. She's been staying with her sister, Webb reported, but that arrangement is becoming strained. The sister has 3 children and a working husband. Karen's presence is disrupting their household routine. Richard studied the surveillance photos showing Karen leaving her sister's modest suburban home, carrying belongings in garbage bags because she'd lost most of her expensive luggage somewhere during the European crisis. She looked older, defeated, wearing discount store clothing because her expensive wardrobe had been sold to pay for legal fees. The final piece of intelligence Webb provided was the most significant. Karen had attempted to contact Richard's mother, apparently hoping to use the elderly woman's influence to negotiate some kind of reconciliation. Your mother refused to see her, Webb said. Told Mrs. Case that she'd made her choice and needed to live with it. Said some other things that were considerably less diplomatic. Richard smiled. His mother might be elderly and living on Social Security, but she had never lost the sharp judgment that had helped her survive decades of poverty. She understood betrayal in ways that comfortable people never could. That evening, Richard received a call from Morrison with news that surprised even him. Richard, the attorney said, her voice carrying unusual excitement. You're not going to believe what just happened. Karen's attorneys have filed a motion requesting spousal support payments of $8,000 per month. Richard was quiet for a moment, processing this development. On what grounds? Standard of living maintenance, Morrison replied. They're arguing that Karen became accustomed to a certain lifestyle during your marriage and that you have an obligation to maintain that lifestyle after divorce, despite the fact that she chose to end the marriage. Richard asked. Despite everything, Morrison confirmed. They're essentially arguing that betraying your husband entitles you to permanent financial support. Richard felt something cold and final settle in his chest. Karen had just made the one move that guaranteed he would show her no mercy. Counterfile, Richard said quietly. I want a complete forensic audit of every penny spent during the last 5 years of our marriage. I want documentation of every luxury purchase, every country club fee, every spa treatment. I want the court to see exactly how Karen spent money she didn't earn while contributing nothing to the household income. That could get expensive, Morrison warned. Forensic accounting at that level. Cost is irrelevant, Richard interrupted. I want Karen to discover what it feels like to have every financial decision scrutinized by strangers. I want her to explain to a judge why she believes betraying her husband entitles her to continued financial support. Morrison's voice carried genuine admiration. You're going to destroy her credibility completely. I'm going to let her destroy her own credibility, Richard corrected. I'm simply providing the forum for her to do it publicly. The next morning brought Richard's first direct contact with Karen in over a month. She called his cell phone at 6 a.m., her voice carrying a desperation that was almost unrecognizable. Richard, please, just talk to me for 5 minutes. I know you're angry. I know I made mistakes, but this has gone too far. I don't have anywhere to live. I can't get a job that pays enough to survive. And now these lawyers are telling me I might not get any support at all. Richard let her speak without interrupting, listening to the complete breakdown of someone who had never learned to take responsibility for her own choices. I never meant for things to go this far, Karen continued through tears. I was confused. I was going through something. Tony made everything seem so easy and perfect, but it was all lies. He disappeared the moment things got difficult. Yes, Richard said quietly when she finally paused. That's exactly what people like Tony do when they realize the cost of their choices. Can we please just talk? Karen begged. Face to face. I'll come wherever you want. I'll do whatever you need me to do. I I need someone to help me figure out how to get through this. Richard considered her request carefully. There was something he needed Karen to understand, a lesson that could only be delivered in person. Meet me at Riverside Diner on 8 Mile, he said finally. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Thank you, Karen whispered. Thank you, Richard. I'll be there. Richard ended the call and immediately contacted Webb. I need complete surveillance for tomorrow's meeting. Audio, video, multiple angles. I want documentation of every word. Expecting trouble? Webb asked. Expecting closure, Richard replied. The next afternoon, Richard arrived at Riverside Diner 15 minutes early and selected a booth that would provide Webb's team with optimal surveillance angles. The diner was one he remembered from his childhood, the kind of place where his mother had taken him for special occasions when she could afford the luxury of eating out. Karen arrived exactly on time, and Richard barely recognized the woman who walked through the door. Gone was the polished doctor's wife with her expensive clothes and professional makeup. The woman approaching his table looked like someone who had been sleeping badly, eating irregularly, and facing the kind of stress that aged people rapidly. She sat across from him in the vinyl booth, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself. You look terrible, Richard observed without malice. Karen laughed bitterly. I feel terrible. I've lost everything, Richard. Everything we built together, everything I thought was mine, all of it's just gone. It was never yours, Richard said quietly. You lived in a house I bought, spent money I earned, enjoyed a lifestyle I created. You confuse being the beneficiary of someone else's work with actually owning the results. Karen's face crumpled. I know that now. I understand. I understand how much I took for granted. But Richard, I'm begging you, please give me another chance. I'll do anything. I'll go to counseling. I'll get a job. I'll prove to you that I can change. Richard studied her face and saw genuine desperation, but also the same fundamental misunderstanding that had led to this moment. Karen, he said calmly, do you understand why we're here? In this diner, having this conversation? Because I destroyed our marriage, she whispered. No, Richard replied. Because you never understood what our marriage was built on. He leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining quiet but carrying absolute authority. For 20 years, I worked 18-hour days to provide for you and Doug. I missed dinners, canceled vacations, turned down opportunities to spend more time at home because I believed I was building something permanent, something that mattered. Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. You took that dedication, Richard continued, and decided it was worth $26,000. You decided that 20 years of my life, my work, my love was equivalent to a vacation with another man. I was stupid, Karen said desperately. I was selfish and stupid, and I made the worst mistake of my life. No, Richard said with terrifying calm. You made the most honest decision of your life. You revealed what you actually thought our marriage was worth. You showed me what 20 years of dedication meant to you. You taught me exactly how much my love and sacrifice mattered in your calculations. Karen reached across the table toward Richard's hands, but he pulled them away. Richard, please. I want you to understand something very clearly, Richard interrupted. This isn't about forgiveness or second chances. This isn't about anger or revenge. This is about mathematics. Karen stared at him in confusion. You calculated that our marriage was worth $26,000, Richard explained. You calculated that my presence in your life was a net negative. You calculated that Tony Bartlett offered you a better deal. You made those calculations deliberately, with full knowledge of what you were choosing. Richard's voice remained perfectly calm, but his eyes carried the cold precision of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. Now you're discovering that your calculations were wrong. Tony disappeared. The comfortable lifestyle wasn't yours to keep. The financial security was dependent on the relationship you chose to destroy. You're experiencing the difference between what you thought you were worth and what you're actually worth in the marketplace. I know I was wrong. Karen sobbed. I know I made terrible mistakes. But please, Richard, I'm drowning here. I don't know how to survive this. Richard was quiet for a long moment, watching this woman who had shared his bed for 20 years, who had borne his child, who had taken everything he offered and decided it wasn't enough. Karen, he said finally, Do you remember what you said to me that night? When you demanded $26,000. Karen shook her head, tears making it impossible for her to speak. You said that Tony needed a vacation. You said I should pay for it. You said this was better for everyone. Richard's voice carried no emotion at all. Do you remember what you said when I agreed to your terms? Karen nodded miserably. You said I was being very reasonable about the divorce. You were pleased that I was accepting your decision so calmly. You thought you had managed the situation perfectly. Richard leaned back in the booth, his expression unchanged. You were right, Karen. I am being perfectly reasonable. I'm accepting your decision completely. You chose to end our marriage for $26,000. I respected that choice. You chose to remove me from your life. I honor that choice. You chose to discover what your life was worth without my support. You're getting exactly what you asked for. But I was wrong, Karen cried, her voice carrying the desperation of someone who is finally understanding the permanence of certain decisions. I was wrong about everything. I was wrong about Tony, wrong about what I wanted, wrong about what mattered. Can't you forgive me for being wrong? Richard studied her face and felt nothing at all. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity. Just the clinical detachment he used when observing the natural progression of a terminal condition. I could forgive you for being wrong, he said quietly, but I can't forgive you for being calculating. You didn't make a mistake, Karen. You made a choice. You weighed your options and decided that 20 years of marriage was worth exactly $26,000. That wasn't an error in judgment. That was a revelation of character. Richard stood up from the booth, placing a $20 bill on the table to cover his coffee. The forensic accounting will be completed next week, he said. The court will see exactly how much money you spent during our marriage versus how much you contributed. The judge will decide whether someone who never worked, never earned, never built anything deserves permanent financial support from the man she betrayed. Richard, please don't leave me like this, Karen begged, grabbing his arm. I have nowhere to go, no way to support myself. You're the only person who can help me. Richard looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. For just a moment, he saw the young nursing student he had married 25 years ago, full of dreams and ambition and plans to make a difference in the world. Then he saw the woman who had stood in his doorway 3 months ago, demanding payment for her vacation with another man, and any trace of sympathy disappeared. Karen, he said with absolute finality, you told me to get out of your life. You told me my presence was toxic. You told me that you and Tony didn't need my energy around anymore. You were very clear about what you wanted. He gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm. You got exactly what you asked for, and now you get to keep it. Richard walked away from the table, leaving Karen crying in the booth of a diner where he had once brought her for their first date 26 years ago. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate, didn't feel the slightest temptation to reconsider. Some lessons could only be learned through complete immersion in their consequences. Some choices were so fundamental that they revealed character in ways that could never be undone or forgiven. Karen Crawford Case had chosen to calculate the value of 20 years of marriage at $26,000. Richard Case was simply ensuring she lived with the full implications of that calculation for the rest of her life. The education was nearly complete. Chapter 9. No mercy, no forgiveness. 6 months after the key that wouldn't fit, Richard Case stood in the observation deck of Metro General Hospital, looking out over the Detroit skyline as dawn broke over the city where he had built and destroyed a life in equal measure. The reports spread across his desk told the story of a campaign that had been more thorough and devastating than even he had initially planned. Doug had survived his crash course in manual labor and was showing genuine signs of character development. Webb's latest surveillance showed Richard's son arriving at construction sites early, staying late to learn new skills, and saving money with the discipline of someone who had learned its true value. More importantly, Doug had stopped asking for help and started finding solutions. He's applied for readmission to college, Webb reported during their final briefing. But this time he's seeking financial aid and planning to work part-time to cover expenses. The disciplinary hearing went better than expected. Community service and probation instead of expulsion. Richard felt genuine pride in this development. Doug was learning what Richard should have taught him years earlier. That everything worth having must be earned, that character was built through facing difficulties rather than avoiding them. What about his academic performance? Richard asked. Complete turnaround, Webb replied. Apparently, he's discovered that when college costs your own money and requires your own labor to maintain, academic performance becomes a much higher priority. Karen's trajectory had been less encouraging but more instructive. The forensic accounting Morrison had commissioned revealed spending patterns that shocked even Richard. Over 5 years, Karen had spent over $200,000 on personal luxuries, spa treatments, shopping trips, country club expenses, and social activities that contributed nothing to the household while providing her with entertainment and status. The judge was not impressed. Morrison reported with evident satisfaction. When Karen's attorney argued that she deserved spousal support to maintain her accustomed lifestyle, His Honor asked exactly what skills or contributions had entitled her to that lifestyle in the first place. The court proceedings had been brutal in their revelation of Karen's character. Under oath, she had been forced to admit that she had contributed no income to the household for 15 years, had no marketable job skills, and had spent money at a rate that would have bankrupted most families. When asked to justify her claim for $8,000 monthly in support payments, she had been unable to provide any rational basis beyond her desire to maintain comfort. The final judgment was zero spousal support. Morrison continued. The judge ruled that Karen's decision to abandon the marriage for another relationship constituted forfeit of any claim to ongoing financial support. Karen had also been forced to confront the social consequences of her choices. The country club had quietly revoked her membership when it became clear she could no longer afford the fees. Her former friends had distanced themselves as the details of her betrayal became public knowledge. She was currently working as a part-time receptionist at a medical clinic, earning barely enough to cover basic expenses while living in a studio apartment that was smaller than the closet in her former home. But it was Tony Bartlett's fate that provided Richard with the deepest satisfaction. The pharmaceutical rep, who had seemed so confident and successful, had been revealed as a man living entirely on credit and false appearances. When the financial pressure of the European crisis had intensified, Tony had made increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his lifestyle. He's facing bankruptcy, Webb reported. Lost his job, lost his apartment, and apparently made some poor choices about where to seek emergency funding. This last point carried ominous implications. Tony had apparently borrowed money from sources that were less understanding than traditional banks about repayment difficulties. Webb's contacts and law enforcement suggested that Tony was currently hiding somewhere in Ohio, trying to avoid creditors who were not bound by legal niceties in their collection methods. Poetic justice, Richard mused. Tony wanted the lifestyle without earning it. Now he's discovering what happens when your debts come due and you don't have the resources to pay them. Richard's phone rang, interrupting his review of the final reports. The caller ID showed his mother's number. Ricky, the elderly woman said, her voice carrying the mixture of affection and concern that had characterized their relationship for 45 years. I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Always, Mom, Richard replied. Are you satisfied now? She asked directly. Have you made your point? Richard considered the question carefully. What do you think I should be satisfied about? You've destroyed that woman completely, his mother said bluntly. Karen came to see me last week, begging me to convince you to help her. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 6 months. What did you tell her? Richard asked. I told her she made her bed, and now she gets to sleep in it, his mother replied with characteristic directness. But Ricky, I also told her something else. Richard waited. I told her that my son isn't cruel, his mother continued. I told her that the man I raised would know when enough was enough. I told her that you learned from your father and me that sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes deserve forgiveness. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city where he had spent his entire adult life building and rebuilding his understanding of loyalty, dedication, and consequences. Mom, he said finally, do you remember what you told me when I was 12 and Jimmy Kostowski stole my bike? His mother was quiet, remembering. You said some people will take advantage of kindness if they think they can get away with it, Richard continued. You said I could either teach Jimmy that stealing had consequences, or I could let him think I was too weak to defend what was mine. I remember, his mother said softly. You also said, Richard continued, that there was a difference between someone who made a mistake and someone who made a choice. Someone who stole because they were hungry was different from someone who stole because they were greedy. Karen was hungry, Ricky, his mother said gently. Maybe not for food, but for something she thought was missing from her life. No, Mom, Richard replied with quiet finality. Karen was greedy. She had everything anyone could reasonably want. A comfortable home, financial security, a family that loved her. She decided it wasn't enough. She decided she wanted something else, and she was willing to destroy what we had built to get it. Richard paused, watching the sun rise over the city where he had learned that some lessons could only be taught through complete, uncompromising consequences. If Karen had come to me and said she was unhappy, we could have talked, Richard continued. If she had said she wanted something different from our marriage, we could have worked together to find solutions. If she had said she needed space or time or counseling, I would have supported her completely. But that's not what she did, his mother said, understanding beginning to color her voice. No, Richard confirmed. She decided our marriage was worth $26,000. She decided I should pay for her vacation with another man. She enlisted our son to deliver ultimatums in our own home. She didn't make a mistake, Mom. She made a calculation. His mother was quiet for a long time. So you're never going to forgive her? She asked finally. Forgiveness suggests that what happened was forgivable, Richard replied. Some things are just mathematics, Mom. Karen calculated the value of our life together and found it lacking. I'm simply ensuring she lives with the full implications of that calculation. After ending the call with his mother, Richard returned to his desk and opened the final report Webb had prepared. It contained a comprehensive analysis of his former family's current status and future prospects. Doug was on a sustainable path toward genuine independence and character development. His son had learned the value of work, the satisfaction of earning what he received, and the importance of taking responsibility for his choices. The lessons had been harsh, but they were taking root. Karen was experiencing the full weight of consequences for her choices, but was not in danger of homelessness or genuine hardship. She had options. Returning to nursing required retraining, but it was possible. Living within her means required adjustments, but it was achievable. Her suffering was psychological and social rather than physical, and it was entirely the result of her own decisions. Tony was learning that some debts could not be negotiated away, and some choices carried permanent consequences. His current difficulties were severe, but they were also self-inflicted through years of living beyond his means and making increasingly desperate financial decisions. Richard closed the report and walked to his apartment window, looking out at the city where he'd spent 6 months methodically dismantling the life he had spent 20 years building. The operation had been successful beyond his initial expectations, but it was complete. His phone buzzed with a text message from Doug. Dad, got promoted to crew leader. 6 months ago, I didn't know how to operate a screwdriver. Thank you for teaching me that I'm stronger than I thought. Richard smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in months. Doug's gratitude wasn't based on financial support or material comfort. It was based on respect for someone who had refused to enable weakness and had instead demanded strength. That evening, Richard made a decision that felt like the natural conclusion of everything he had learned over the past 6 months. He called Elena Rodriguez and invited her to dinner at the same restaurant where he and Karen had celebrated their wedding anniversary just 1 year earlier. Are you sure you're ready for that? Elena asked carefully, going back to a place with so many memories? The memories aren't painful anymore, Richard replied honestly. They're just information. Data about choices I made when I believed different things about loyalty and dedication. Over dinner, Richard found himself able to discuss the past 6 months with clinical detachment. Elena listened as he outlined the systematic approach he had taken to teaching consequences, the methodical precision with which he had removed protection and support, the calculated way he had allowed natural consequences to operate without interference. Do you have any regrets? Elena asked as they finished their meal. Richard considered the question carefully. I regret that I spent 20 years teaching my family the wrong lessons. I regret that I enabled Karen's irresponsibility and Doug's entitlement instead of preparing them for real life. I regret that I confused providing with protection and love with enabling. But you don't regret what you've done since. Elena pressed. No, Richard said with complete certainty. I gave them exactly what they asked for. They wanted me out of their lives, and I honored that request. They wanted to discover what life looked like without my support, and I provided that opportunity. They wanted freedom from my expectations and standards, and I granted that freedom completely. Elena studied his face and saw something she had never seen before. Not the driven surgeon who worked 18-hour days, not the devoted husband and father who sacrificed everything for his family, but a man who had learned the difference between love and enabling, between kindness and weakness. What happens now, she asked. Richard smiled. Not the cold expression he had worn during the campaign against his former family, but something warmer and more genuine. Now I build something new, he said simply. Something based on mutual respect instead of one-sided sacrifice. Something where dedication is appreciated rather than exploited. Something where loyalty is earned rather than assumed. As they left the restaurant, Richard felt a sense of completion that was deeper than satisfaction. He had spent 6 months teaching lessons that should have been learned years earlier. He had demonstrated that actions carried consequences, that choices had prices, and that some decisions were too fundamental to be forgiven or forgotten. Karen would spend the rest of her life understanding that comfort and security were not entitlements, but privileges that must be earned and maintained. Doug had learned that everything worth having required work, dedication, and responsibility. Tony had discovered that appearances and charm were no substitute for genuine substance and character. And Richard Case had learned the most important lesson of all, that a man who could perform 17-hour surgeries possessed exactly the stamina required for sustained retaliation when betrayed by the people he loved most. He had been their protector, their provider, their shield against the harsh realities of the world. When they decided they no longer wanted his protection, he had become their teacher instead. The lessons were complete. The reckoning was finished. And Richard Case was finally free to build a life with people who understood the difference between love and exploitation, between dedication and enablement, between family and parasites. Some keys, once they stopped fitting, could never be made to work again. But sometimes that was exactly what needed to happen. Epilogue. 2 years later, Richard received a wedding invitation. Doug Case was marrying a young woman he had met at community college, a nursing student who worked nights at a restaurant to pay for her education. The invitation was handwritten on simple paper, and the ceremony would be held at a small church with a reception in the church basement. Richard attended the wedding and watched his son marry someone who understood the value of work, the importance of earning what you received, and the satisfaction of building something through mutual effort and respect. Doug's bride reminded Richard of Karen as she had been 25 years earlier, ambitious, dedicated, determined to make a difference. But she also possessed something Karen had lost along the way: humility. After the ceremony, Doug approached his father with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned difficult lessons and grown stronger because of them. "Thank you," Doug said simply, "for teaching me that I was capable of more than I thought." Richard nodded, understanding that his son had finally learned the difference between enablement and love, between comfort and strength. "Your mother wanted to come," Doug said carefully, "but she understood that some bridges can't be rebuilt." "How is she?" Richard asked, more from clinical curiosity than emotional investment. "Learning," Doug replied. "Slowly. She's working full-time now, sharing an apartment with another nurse. She's back in school, updating her certifications. It's hard for her, but she's finally understanding what you try to teach us about earning what you have." Richard nodded. "And Tony?" Doug's expression darkened slightly. "Last I heard, he was working a used car lot in Toledo. Apparently, his debt situation caught up with him in ways that required him to relocate permanently." Richard felt no satisfaction in this news, only the clinical observation that consequences had run their natural course. "Dad," Doug said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this was something he'd been planning to say for a long time. I understand now why you did what you did. At the time, I thought you were being cruel. But you weren't punishing us. You were educating us. You were teaching us lessons we should have learned years earlier. Richard looked at his son, this young man who had grown from an entitled, soft boy into someone capable of building a life through his own effort and determination. The cruelty would have been continuing to enable your weaknesses while pretending it was kindness, Richard replied. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to protect people from the consequences of their choices. Doug smiled, an expression of genuine understanding rather than the entitled smirk Richard remembered from their last conversation in the old house. Sarah understands that, Doug said, nodding toward his new wife, who was accepting congratulations from wedding guests with the same quiet dignity she brought to her work. She knows that anything worth having requires effort to build and constant work to maintain. Richard watched his daughter-in-law interact with a modest gathering of friends and family. She treated everyone with equal respect, the wealthy doctors who were Richard's colleagues and the construction workers Doug had befriended during his education in manual labor. She's good for you, Richard observed. She makes me better, Doug corrected. Every day, I have to earn being worthy of someone who works as hard as she does. As the reception continued, Richard found himself in conversation with Sarah's father, a man who had worked his entire life as an electrician, put 3 daughters through college, and understood the value of everything he had because he had earned it all himself. Your boy's got good character, the man said, watching Doug help clear tables without being asked. Wasn't always the case, I hear. No, Richard agreed. Character is built through facing difficulties, not avoiding them. Doug learned that the hard way. Sometimes the hard way is the only way. The electrician replied with the wisdom of someone who had spent his life solving real problems with practical solutions. Driving home that evening, Richard reflected on how completely his life had changed in 2 years. The man who had once worked 18-hour days to provide for people who viewed his sacrifice as entitlement had been replaced by someone who understood the difference between love and enabling. He had sold his practice to a younger surgeon and now worked as a consultant, teaching trauma procedures to residents while maintaining a schedule that allowed for genuine relationships with people who appreciated rather than exploited his dedication. Elena had become his partner in both professional and personal contexts, a woman who understood the value of mutual respect because she had built her own successful career through the same combination of skill and determination that had driven Richard's achievements. Most importantly, Richard had learned to distinguish between people who deserved his protection and people who would exploit his willingness to provide it. Doug had earned his way back into his father's life by demonstrating genuine change and accepting responsibility for his previous choices. Karen remained excluded not out of cruelty, but because she had never acknowledged that her betrayal was anything more than a mistake that should be forgiven and forgotten. 6 months after Doug's wedding, Richard received a letter forwarded through Morrison's office. Karen had apparently tracked down his new address and was making one final attempt at reconciliation. Richard, I know you probably won't read this, but I have to try one more time. I've spent 2 years learning what it means to support myself, to work for what I need, to live within my means. I understand now what I took for granted during our marriage. I'm not asking you to take me back. I know that's impossible, but I'm asking you to consider that people can change, that they can learn from their mistakes and become better. I'm asking you to believe that the woman who demanded $26,000 for a vacation with another man is not the same person writing this letter. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but I'm asking anyway, not for money or support or anything material. I'm asking for the possibility of forgiveness, not reconciliation, just acknowledgement that I've learned the lessons you try to teach me. I hope you're happy. I hope you found someone who appreciates what I was too foolish to value. I hope Doug continues to grow into the man you helped to become. With genuine regret and respect, Karen. Richard read the letter twice, then placed it in his desk drawer without responding. Karen's words suggested genuine understanding, but they also revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding that had led to their divorce. She was still thinking in terms of forgiveness and reconciliation, as if the betrayal had been a simple mistake that could be corrected through sufficient remorse and behavioral change. She still didn't understand that some choices were so revealing of character that they couldn't be undone by subsequent growth or insight. Richard had forgiven Karen in the sense that he no longer felt anger or desire for revenge. But forgiveness didn't require forgetting, and understanding didn't mandate reconciliation. Karen had shown him who she really was when she demanded payment for her vacation with another man. That revelation of character was permanent, regardless of whatever lessons she might have learned since. 2 years later, Richard married Elena in a simple ceremony attended by people who understood that love was built through mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. Doug served as best man, and Sarah was Elena's maid of honor. Richard's elderly mother, now approaching 90 but still sharp in her judgment of character, gave the blessing. Ricky found someone who knows the difference between taking and sharing, she told the small gathering of friends and family. That's the secret to a marriage that lasts. Both people have to know the difference between love and exploitation. As Richard and Elena exchanged vows they had written themselves, Richard reflected on how completely his understanding of relationships had evolved. The man who had once believed that unlimited giving was the highest expression of love had learned that sustainable relationships required balance, boundaries, and mutual investment. Elena's vows captured this understanding perfectly. I promise to build something with you, not take something from you. I promise to share the work, not just the benefits. I promise to earn your dedication every day, not assume it as my right. Richard's response was equally grounded in the lessons he had learned through the destruction and rebuilding of his life. I promise to protect what we build together, not enable what threatens to destroy it. I promise to love you enough to tell you difficult truths, not comfortable lies. I promise to ensure our relationship serves both of us, not just one. 10 years after the key that wouldn't fit, Richard Case looked back on the complete transformation of his life with satisfaction that was deeper than vindication. He had learned the difference between love and enabling, between kindness and weakness, between family and parasites. Doug had built a successful career as a construction supervisor, earned a degree in engineering through night school, and was raising children who understood that everything worthwhile required effort. His marriage was strong because both partners contributed equally to building and maintaining their life together. Karen had completed her nursing recertification and was working in pediatric oncology, the field she had originally claimed to care about before comfort and status became her priorities. She lived modestly but independently, having finally learned the lessons about self-sufficiency that Richard had tried to teach her 20 years too late. Tony had disappeared entirely from their circle, having learned that some debts carried consequences that extended far beyond financial obligation. And Richard had built a new life with Elena based on principles he should have insisted on from the beginning: mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the understanding that love was not a license for exploitation. The house where he now lived was smaller than the one Karen had lost, but it was filled with people who appreciated rather than assumed his presence. The work he did was less demanding, but more satisfying because it served people who understood the value of expertise earned through decades of dedication. Most importantly, Richard had learned to recognize the difference between people who deserved his protection and people who would exploit his willingness to provide it. Some people earned trust through their actions and maintained it through continued demonstration of character. Others revealed themselves to be fundamentally predatory, viewing kindness as weakness and dedication as entitlement. The key that wouldn't fit had unlocked the most important lesson of Richard Case's life: that a man's greatest strength was not his willingness to sacrifice everything for the people he loved, but his ability to distinguish between people who deserved such sacrifice and people who would exploit it. Some doors, once closed, should remain closed forever. Some bridges, once burned, should never be rebuilt. Some lessons, once learned, should never be forgotten. And some betrayals were so fundamental that they revealed truths about character that no amount of subsequent change could alter. Richard Case had spent the first half of his adult life learning how to build and protect. He had spent the second half learning when to tear down and walk away. Both lessons had been equally valuable, and both had been absolutely necessary. The reckoning was complete. The education was finished. And Richard Case was finally free to live a life built on truth rather than illusion, respect rather than exploitation, and love that strengthened rather than weakened those who received it. Some keys stop fitting for a reason. Sometimes, that's the most valuable thing they can teach you. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Detective Ray Morrison had always prided himself on being a man of principle. At 54, with 28 years on the force, he commanded respect in the small town of Millbrook. His daughter, Linda, had married well, or so he thought. Tom Brennan, her husband of 18 years, was a successful construction contractor who'd built half the new developments in town. Tom was quiet, methodical, and had never given Ray any trouble. Until now. The call came on a Tuesday evening. Ray's grandson, Kyle, had been pulled over for speeding. Nothing unusual there. 16-year-old boys and fast cars were a dangerous combination. But when Ray arrived at the scene, something felt wrong. His partner, Officer Danny Walsh, was acting nervous, sweating despite the cool October air. "What's the story?" Ray asked, approaching Kyle's beat-up Honda Civic. "Kid was doing 45 in a 30, Danny said, not meeting Ray's eyes. "But Ray, we found something." Ray's stomach dropped as Danny led him to the passenger side of the car. There, plain as day, was a small baggie of what looked like marijuana tucked under the seat. "That's not mine," Kyle protested, tears streaming down his face. "Grandpa, you have to believe me." Ray studied his grandson's face. The boy was scared, genuinely terrified. But the evidence was there. In a town where Ray's reputation mattered, appearances were everything. Tom arrived 20 minutes later, his work boots still covered in concrete dust. Ray watched as his son-in-law's face went from confusion to cold fury in the span of seconds. "This is ridiculous," Tom said, his voice deadly calm. "Kyle doesn't do drugs." "The evidence says otherwise," Danny interjected, earning a sharp look from Tom. Ray found himself in an impossible position. His grandson, his daughter's family, his own reputation, all hanging in the balance. The decision he made in that moment would change everything. "I'm sorry, Tom," Ray said, his voice heavy, "but we have to follow protocol." As they handcuffed Kyle and loaded him into the patrol car, Ray caught something in Tom's expression. It wasn't defeat or resignation. It was the look of a man taking notes, memorizing faces, calculating odds. Ray had seen that look before, in the eyes of criminals who were already planning their next move. Chapter 2. Lines Drawn. The Brennan household had never felt colder. Linda paced the living room, her auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, stress etched across her face. She'd been crying on and off since the call came in about Kyle's arrest. "We need to support Dad," she said for the third time in an hour. "He's just doing his job." Tom sat in his leather recliner, outwardly calm, but internally seething. He'd built this house with his own hands, every board and nail placed with precision. Now it felt like a trap. "Your father planted that bag, Linda." The words hung in the air like smoke from fire. Linda stopped pacing, her face going white. "How dare you?" she whispered. "My father is a good man. He's dedicated his life to this community. Your father is a dirty cop who just destroyed our son's future to teach me a lesson." Linda's hand cracked across Tom's face with surprising force. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Don't you ever speak about my father that way again," she hissed. "Kyle was probably buying drugs from some dealer and got caught. Dad saved him from something worse." Tom touched his cheek, feeling the sting, but his expression never changed. "So that's how it's going to be. That's how it's always been, Tom. Family first." The irony wasn't lost on him. Family first, except when it came to the family he'd built with her. Later that night, after Linda had gone to bed, Tom made a series of phone calls. The first was to Marcus Riley, his lawyer and old college roommate. The second was to a private investigator named Janet Cross. The third was to a number he'd hoped never to use again. Vincent? It's Tom Brennan. I need a favor. Vincent Castellano's gravelly voice carried decades of cigarettes and harder living. Tommy boy, been a long time. What's eating you? Someone hurt my kid. I need information. Information costs extra these days. Money's not a problem. There was a pause. Must be serious if you're calling me. Text me the details. I'll be in touch. As Tom ended the call, he didn't notice Linda standing in the hallway, having heard enough to know that her husband was planning something that would tear their family apart. Chapter 3. The Architect's Blueprint. The next morning brought an uncomfortable family meeting at Ray Morrison's house. Linda's mother, Carol, bustled around the kitchen making coffee while Linda's younger brother, Mike, sat at the dining table looking uncomfortable. Mike was a firefighter, 32 years old, with the same strong jaw as his father, but softer eyes. This is all going to blow over, Carol said, her voice artificially bright. Kids make mistakes. Kyle will learn from this. Tom sat across from Ray, studying the man who'd raised the woman he'd loved for 18 years. Ray was still handsome at 54, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that commanded rooms. But Tom was looking deeper now, seeing things he'd missed before. The question is, Ray said, how do we handle this as a family? By telling the truth, Tom replied evenly. The truth is that your son was caught with illegal substances, Ray shot back. I could have looked the other way, but that wouldn't have been right. Dad's right, Linda said, reaching across to squeeze her father's hand. We can't enable Kyle's behavior. Mike shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should focus on getting him help instead of assigning blame. Tom almost smiled. Mike was the only one in the room with any sense, which made what was coming even more tragic. Kyle's already talking to a counselor, Tom said. Court appointed, but he maintains his innocence. Of course he does, Ray scoffed. They all do. That afternoon, Tom received his first package from Vincent. It contained surveillance photos, financial records, and a detailed timeline of Ray Morrison's activities over the past 6 months. What Tom found buried in those records made him lean back in his office chair and whistle low. Detective Ray Morrison wasn't just a dirty cop. He was an entrepreneur. The marijuana planted in Kyle's car had come from evidence lockup, part of a larger operation where confiscated drugs were being resold through a network of dealers. Ray wasn't the mastermind, but he was a key player. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was who Ray's primary partner was in the operation, Danny Walsh, the nervous officer who discovered the drugs in Kyle's car. Tom smiled for the first time in days. He was an architect by training, someone who understood that every building needed a solid foundation before you could construct the walls. Ray Morrison had just given him the perfect foundation for his revenge. The second package from Vincent arrived that evening. This one contained something even more valuable, a recording device small enough to fit inside a pen and detailed instructions on how to use it. Linda found Tom in his study, surrounded by papers and photos. What are you working on? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Just some project estimates, Tom lied smoothly. The Patterson development is moving faster than expected. She moved closer, and Tom casually covered the photos with a blueprint. But Linda had seen enough. Those looked like pictures of my father. Tom looked up at his wife, the woman he'd shared his bed and his dreams with for 18 years, and felt something die inside his chest. They were pictures of the courthouse, he said, for the new municipal complex bid. Linda nodded, but Tom could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe him, which meant she'd already chosen her side. That night, as Linda slept beside him, Tom stared at the ceiling and made his final decision. He'd try to build a life based on trust and love, but those foundations had proven faulty. It was time to build something else entirely, something permanent. Chapter 4. Gathering Storms. The preliminary hearing for Kyle's case was scheduled for the following Monday. Tom spent the weekend preparing, but not in the way his family expected. While Linda thought he was meeting with their lawyer, Tom was actually sitting in Vincent Castellano's warehouse office on the wrong side of town. Vincent looked exactly like someone who'd spent 40 years walking the line between legal and illegal. Scarred hands, gray stubble, and eyes that had seen too much. His warehouse was officially an auto parts distributor, but everyone knew Vincent dealt in information, favors, and occasionally harder services. "Your boy's clean," Vincent said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. "Model student, no priors, doesn't even drink. Meanwhile, your father-in-law's been supplementing his pension for the past 2 years." Tom opened the folder and found photographs, bank statements, and phone records. Ray Morrison and Danny Walsh had been skimming from evidence lockup and selling confiscated drugs back to dealers. The operation was small but profitable, about $50,000 over 2 years. "Why frame Kyle?" Tom asked. "Near as I can tell, your boy was just convenient." Morrison needed to show his partner he was serious about maintaining cover. Planting evidence on a relative sends a message: nobody's above suspicion. Tom studied a photograph of Ray counting money in what looked like a storage unit. How solid is this evidence? Solid enough to end careers and start prison sentences. But here's the thing, Tommy. Your wife's been asking questions about you too. That stopped Tom cold. "What kind of questions?" "She hired a PI 3 days ago. Wants to know where you've been spending your time, who you've been talking to. Woman's preparing for war." Tom leaned back in his chair, feeling the pieces of his life rearranging themselves. Linda wasn't just defending her father. She was actively working against her own husband. "There's more," Vincent continued. "Your brother-in-law, Mike? He's been meeting with Linda and your father-in-law. Looks like the whole family's circling the wagons." "Mike's a good guy," Tom said, though doubt was creeping in. "Good guys sometimes do bad things when family pressure gets applied. From what I can see, they're planning to present a united front at the hearing. Your son's going to get thrown under the bus, and you're going to be painted as a delusional father who can't accept his kid's guilt." Tom stood up, his mind already working through contingencies. "I need more than evidence of the drug dealing. I need insurance." Vincent grinned, showing teeth stained by decades of coffee and cigarettes. "Now you're talking my language. What kind of insurance?" "The kind that makes people think twice before they betray family." That evening, Tom returned home to find Linda hosting a family dinner. Ray, Carol, and Mike were all there, along with Kyle, who looked miserable and defeated. The conversation stopped when Tom walked in. "We were just discussing Kyle's future," Linda said, her voice artificially sweet. Tom looked at his son, saw the hopelessness in the boy's eyes, and felt his resolve harden. "And what did you decide?" "Kyle's going to plead guilty to possession," Ray said firmly. "With my recommendation, he'll get community service and probation. Clean slate after a year." "No," Tom said simply. The room went silent. Even Carol stopped serving dinner. "Excuse me." Ray's voice had an edge to it. "Kyle's innocent. He's not pleading guilty to anything." Mike cleared his throat. "Tom, maybe it's better to just put this behind us. Fighting it will only make things worse." Tom looked at his brother-in-law, someone he'd considered a friend for over a decade. "Whose side are you on, Mike?" "I'm on the family's side." "So am I," Tom replied. "The question is, which family?" Linda stood up abruptly. "Kyle, go to your room." "Mom, I didn't." "Now." After Kyle left, the real conversation began. "You're being unreasonable," Carol said. "Ray is trying to help." "Ray is trying to cover his ass," Tom shot back. Ray stood up, his hand instinctively moving toward where his service weapon would normally be. "I think you should be very careful about what you say next, Tom." Tom smiled, and something in that smile made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. "Are you threatening me, Ray?" "In my own house." The tension was broken by Linda's voice, cold and final. "If you can't support this family's decision, maybe you should leave." Tom looked around the table at faces that had once been welcoming, now closed and hostile. Vincent had been right. They'd already chosen sides. "I'll pack a bag," Tom said quietly. As he headed upstairs, he heard Linda's voice behind him. "You have until Monday to come to your senses." Tom paused on the stairs, not turning around. "Monday's the hearing. I'll see you in court." Chapter 5. The Perfect Storm. Tom checked into the Millbrook Inn, a small hotel downtown that catered to business travelers and people going through divorces. The irony wasn't lost on him. From his room, he could see the courthouse where Kyle's fate would be decided in 3 days. His phone rang constantly. Linda trying to negotiate, Mike attempting to mediate, even Carol calling to appeal to his Christian sense of forgiveness. Tom let them all go to voicemail. Vincent arrived Sunday evening with the final pieces of Tom's plan. "Your father-in-law's been busy," Vincent said, spreading new photographs across the hotel room's small table. "He met with the prosecutor yesterday. Looks like they're not just railroading your kid. They're planning to charge him as an adult." Tom's hands clenched into fists. "On what grounds?" "Possession with intent to distribute. They're claiming the amount found was too large for personal use." "That's impossible." The bag was tiny. Vincent's smile was grim. "Funny thing about evidence lockers, things have a way of growing. My source says the bag that'll appear in court tomorrow will be considerably larger than the one they showed you Tuesday night." Tom stared out the window at the courthouse, his mind racing. They weren't just covering up Ray's corruption. They were actively destroying Kyle to do it. "Here's what you asked for," Vincent said, sliding a small device across the table. "Digital recorder, voice-activated, 8-hour battery life. Completely undetectable once it's in place. And the other thing?" Vincent handed him a manila envelope. "Birth certificate, social security records, medical files. Your wife's been busy over the years. More secrets than a politician." Tom opened the envelope and found documentation that made him sit down hard on the hotel bed. Linda hadn't just been hiding things from him. She'd been lying about fundamental aspects of their life together. "How long have you known?" Vincent asked. "I suspected something was off about 5 years ago. But this..." Tom held up a birth certificate that showed Kyle wasn't his biological son. The dates didn't lie. Linda had been pregnant before they met, not after. "The father, Danny Walsh, your father-in-law's partner." Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So Kyle has actually raised grandson through Danny, not me. That's why they're so eager to protect the family name. And why they're willing to destroy the kid to protect themselves. If this comes out, it exposes both the affair and the drug operation." Tom stood up and walked to the window. Below, the courthouse looked peaceful in the evening light. Tomorrow, it would become a battleground. "Vincent, I need you to do something for me. Name it. I want you to be in that courtroom tomorrow. And I want you to record everything." Monday morning arrived gray and cold. Tom dressed in his best suit, navy blue, conservative, the kind of outfit that suggested respectability and quiet confidence. He ate breakfast alone in the hotel restaurant, watching the local news report on the troubled teenager from a prominent construction family. The courthouse was already busy when Tom arrived. Marcus Riley, his lawyer, met him at the steps. "Tom, we need to talk," Marcus said urgently. "The prosecution just filed amended charges. They're claiming Kyle had enough marijuana for distribution." "I know," Tom said calmly. "How could you? Never mind. The point is, this changes everything. We're not talking about simple possession anymore. This can mean real jail time." Tom looked at his oldest friend, someone he'd trusted for 20 years. "Marcus, whose side are you on?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you working for me? Or did someone get to you too?" Marcus's face went pale. "Tom, you're being paranoid. Nobody got to me. Then why didn't you fight the amended charges? Why are you pushing me to accept a plea deal that ruins my son's life?" Marcus looked around nervously. "Because sometimes you have to accept reality." Tom nodded slowly. "You're right. Sometimes you do." Inside the courthouse, Tom saw his family gathered in the gallery. Linda sat with her parents, Mike beside them, all presenting a united front. They looked like they were attending a funeral, which in a way they were. Kyle sat at the defendant's table, looking small and lost in his oversized suit. When he saw Tom, the boy's face lit up with hope and relief. "Dad, you came?" "Of course I came," Tom said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. The word son felt different now, but the love remained the same. Biology didn't determine family, loyalty did. As the judge entered the courtroom, Tom caught Vincent's eye. The man was sitting in the back row, dressed like any other court observer, his equipment hidden and ready. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hawkins. Tom stood, feeling the weight of the manila envelope in his jacket pocket. In a few minutes, everyone in this room would understand the true meaning of family loyalty and betrayal. Chapter 6. The Reckoning Begins. Judge Hawkins was a stern woman in her 60s, known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for theatrics. She'd been on the bench for 15 years and had seen every kind of case Millbrook could produce. "We're here for the arraignment of Kyle Brennan," she announced. What does the defendant plead?" Marcus started to stand, but Tom placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Your Honor, before we enter a plea, I'd like to present evidence that's relevant to this case." Judge Hawkins frowned. "Mr. Brennan, this is an arraignment, not a trial. Evidence presentation comes later." "Your Honor, this evidence directly relates to the integrity of the charges being filed. I believe it's relevant to the court's consideration of bail and plea arrangements." From the prosecution table, District Attorney Robert Shun looked annoyed. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense is clearly stalling." Tom stood up. "Your Honor, I'm not the defense attorney. I'm the defendant's father, and I have information that this court needs to see." The murmur from the gallery was immediate. Linda half rose from her seat, her face a mask of confusion and growing alarm. Judge Hawkins considered for a moment. "Mr. Brennan, you have 5 minutes to present whatever evidence you think is relevant. But this better not be a waste of the court's time." Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out the manila envelope. But instead of opening it immediately, he turned to face the gallery. "Your Honor, before I present this evidence, I need to ask Detective Ray Morrison to stand." Ray's face went white, but he stood slowly, his police dress uniform immaculate. "Detective Morrison, you were the responding officer who discovered the alleged marijuana in my son's vehicle, correct?" "I was on scene, yes," Ray said carefully. "And you can swear under oath that the evidence was not planted." D.A. Chin stood up. "Objection. Mr. Brennan is not qualified to conduct an examination." "Sustained," Judge Hawkins said. "Mr. Brennan, get to your point." Tom opened the envelope and pulled out a series of photographs. "Your Honor, these photographs show Detective Morrison and Officer Danny Walsh engaged in what appears to be the sale of confiscated drugs from the evidence locker." The courtroom erupted. Ray sat down hard, his face ashen. Linda was on her feet, shouting something Tom couldn't hear over the general chaos. Judge Hawkins was banging her gavel for order. "Furthermore," Tom continued, his voice cutting through the noise, "I have bank records showing that Detective Morrison has received over $50,000 in unexplained deposits over the past 2 years." D.A. Chun was frantically conferring with his assistants. Ray Morrison looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Your Honor," Tom said, "I submit that these charges against my son are part of a cover-up designed to protect a corrupt police officer who needed to demonstrate his legitimacy by sacrificing an innocent boy." Judge Hawkins had restored order, but barely. "Mr. Brennan, these are very serious allegations. Do you have proof to back them up?" Tom handed the envelope to the bailiff. "Everything's in there, Your Honor. Financial records, surveillance photographs, and witness statements." "Your Honor," D.A. Chun said desperately, "we request an immediate recess to examine this alleged evidence." "Granted. We'll reconvene in 2 hours." As the courtroom began to empty, Tom felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Ray Morrison, his face a mixture of rage and desperation. "You son of a bitch," Ray hissed. "You have no idea what you just done." Tom looked at the man who'd raised his wife, who'd been a grandfather to Kyle, who'd thrown them all away to protect his own interests. "I know exactly what I've done," Tom said quietly. "I've started telling the truth." Ray leaned closer. "This isn't over." "You're right," Tom replied. "It's just beginning." As Ray walked away, Tom noticed Linda approaching. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes held something he'd never seen before, pure hatred. "How could you do this to my family?" she whispered. Tom looked at the woman he'd loved for 18 years, the mother of the boy he'd raised as his own son, and felt the last of his old life die. "I didn't do anything to your family, Linda. Your family did it to themselves." She raised her hand as if to slap him again, but stopped when she saw his expression. Something in Tom's eyes warned her that this time, he might not just stand there and take it. "This marriage is over," she said. "Yes," Tom agreed. "It is." As Linda walked away, Tom turned to Kyle, who'd been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. "Dad, what's happening?" Tom put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "We're going home, son. Your real home." For the first time in a week, Kyle smiled. Chapter 7. Unraveling. The 2-hour recess turned into an all-day investigation. By 5 o'clock, Ray Morrison and Danny Walsh were in custody, and D.A. Chun was in Judge Hawkins' chambers explaining how his office had failed to properly vet the evidence in Kyle's case. Tom sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Kyle and Marcus, watching the news coverage on the small television mounted in the corner. The scandal was already making statewide news, small-town police corruption exposed by desperate father. "How long have you been planning this?" Marcus asked quietly. "Since the moment Linda slapped me for telling the truth about her father," Tom replied. Kyle looked confused. "But Dad, how did you know Grandpa was dirty?" Tom studied his son's face. Kyle still didn't know about Danny Walsh being his biological father, and Tom wasn't sure he ever needed to. Some truths were more destructive than helpful. "Sometimes you have to dig to find the truth," Tom said. "And sometimes the truth finds you." Vincent Castellano appeared at their table like a well-dressed ghost. "Mind if I sit?" Marcus tensed. "Tom, who is this guy?" "A friend," Tom said simply. Vincent sat down and placed a small digital recorder on the table. "Thought you'd want to hear this." He pressed play, and Linda's voice filled the small space around their table. "We need to make sure Tom looks unstable," she was saying. "If we can show he's having some kind of breakdown, it'll discredit whatever evidence he thinks he has." Ray's voice came next. "Danny's already talked to the prosecutor. They're willing to amend the charges to adult felony levels if Tom doesn't back down." "What about Kyle?" That was Mike's voice. "Kyle's expendable," Ray said coldly. "Better to sacrifice one kid than lose everything." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, documenting a conversation that had taken place just that morning in the courthouse parking lot. Tom listened to his wife and her family plot against him and Kyle with a detachment that surprised him. "Jesus, Tom," Marcus whispered. "They were going to destroy you both." Kyle's face had gone pale. "Mom really said that? That I was expendable?" Tom reached over and squeezed his son's hand. "Your mother chose her side, Kyle. Now we know where we stand." Vincent turned off the recorder. "There's more if you want it. Your brother-in-law, Mike, wasn't entirely on board with the plan, but he wasn't willing to stand up to his father either." "What about the drug charges against Kyle?" Marcus asked. "Dropped," Vincent said with satisfaction, along with about 6 other cases that Ray Morrison was involved in over the past year. DA's office is in full damage control mode. Tom stood up. "Kyle, we're going home." "To the hotel?" "No, to our real home." The Brennan house looked different as they pulled into the driveway. Linda's car was gone, and so was most of the furniture from the front room. Tom wasn't surprised. She was probably at her parents' house, regrouping and planning her next move. They walked through the house together, taking inventory. Linda had been busy during the day's court proceedings. She'd taken her clothes, jewelry, and several pieces of furniture that had belonged to her grandmother. But she'd also taken things that weren't hers: Kyle's computer, Tom's tools, even the photo albums that contained Kyle's baby pictures. "She took everything," Kyle said sadly. "She took things," Tom corrected. "There's a difference." That evening, as Kyle did homework at the kitchen table and tried to pretend everything was normal, Tom sat in his study planning the next phase of his campaign. Vincent had provided him with enough evidence to destroy Ray Morrison's career and send him to prison. But that was just the beginning. His phone rang. Linda's number. "Hello, Linda. We need to talk." Her voice was carefully controlled, but Tom could hear the strain underneath. "I'm listening. Meet me at Morrison's diner. 1 hour. Come alone." "Why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, you'll never see Kyle again." The line went dead. Tom stared at the phone, feeling a familiar cold anger settle in his chest. Linda had just made her biggest mistake yet. He called Vincent. "I need backup," Tom said. "What kind of backup?" "The kind that makes sure I walk out of Morrison's diner in one piece." "On my way." As Tom got ready to leave, Kyle looked up from his homework. "Where are you going, Dad?" "To end this," Tom said. Once and for all. Chapter 8. The Final Gambit. Morrison's Diner sat on the edge of town, a classic American eatery that had been serving truckers and locals for 40 years. At 8 o'clock on a Monday night, it was nearly empty except for a few regulars at the counter and Linda Brennan sitting alone in a back booth. Tom entered through the front door, while Vincent and two of his associates positioned themselves outside. Through the windows, Tom could see them taking up strategic positions around the building. Linda looked up as he approached. She'd been crying, but her makeup was perfect and her posture was straight. Even in crisis, she maintained appearances. "Sit down," she said. Tom remained standing. "You said something about Kyle." "I did." Linda's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "He's not your son, Tom. Not biologically." "I know." That stopped her cold. "You know, Danny Walsh is his father. You were 3 months pregnant when we met, not 3 months after we got married." Linda's facade cracked slightly. "How long have you known?" "Suspected for years. Confirmed yesterday." Tom slid into the booth across from her. "The question is, why tell me now?" "Because I want you to understand what's at stake here. Kyle belongs with his real family." Tom almost laughed. "His real family? You mean the drug-dealing cops who just tried to frame him for felony possession?" "My father made mistakes. Your father is a criminal who is willing to sacrifice his own grandson to save his own skin." Linda leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Danny wants to be part of Kyle's life. He wants to claim his son. Danny's in jail. He'll make bail, and when he does, he's going to file for custody." Tom studied his wife's face, looking for tells. She was lying about something, but he couldn't pinpoint what. Even if that were true, Tom said, "Kyle's 16. He's old enough to choose where he wants to live. Not if his legal father is declared unfit." The threat was clear. Linda and her family were planning to attack Tom's fitness as a parent, probably claiming mental instability or worse. "Let me guess," Tom said. "I'm having a breakdown? Paranoid delusions? Making wild accusations against respected police officers." Linda's silence was answer enough. Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, the recorder Vincent had given him. "You should know that everything you've said in the last 5 minutes has been recorded." Linda's face went white. "You're wearing a wire?" "I'm protecting myself from a family of criminals and liars." "Tom, please." "Here's what's going to happen," Tom said, cutting her off. "You're going to call Danny Walsh and tell him that any attempt to claim paternity or file for custody will result in me releasing certain information to the media." "What information?" Tom smiled coldly. "The information about how Kyle isn't just Danny's son. He's also Ray's grandson through his daughter's affair with his partner. The same partner who's been helping Ray sell confiscated drugs for 2 years." Linda's face crumbled. "You bastard. I'm not finished. You're also going to sign divorce papers granting me full custody of Kyle and waiving any claim to alimony or property settlement. I'll never. Or I release the recordings of your family planning to frame an innocent boy for felony drug possession." Linda stared at him for a long moment. "I don't recognize you anymore." "Good," Tom said, standing up. "The man you married was too trusting. He believed in family loyalty and keeping his mouth shut when people he loved did terrible things. That man is gone. What if I refuse?" Tom looked down at the woman he'd once planned to grow old with. "Then you'll find out just how ruthless I can be when someone threatens my son." As he walked toward the door, Linda called after him. "This isn't over." Tom paused without turning around. "Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet." Outside, Vincent was waiting by Tom's truck. "How'd it go?" "She's going to fight." "Expected that." "You ready for the next phase?" Tom looked back at the diner, where Linda was still sitting in the booth, probably calling her father or her lawyer or both. "What's the next phase?" Vincent grinned. "The phase where we stop playing defense and start playing offense." Chapter 9. Ashes and New Foundations. 3 months later, Tom stood in the ruins of the Morrison family empire and felt something approaching satisfaction. Ray Morrison had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for drug trafficking and corruption. Danny Walsh got 3 years for his role in the operation. The Millbrook Police Department was under federal oversight, and half the force had been replaced. Linda had fought the divorce for exactly 6 weeks before Vincent's second phase of evidence convinced her that surrender was her only option. The recordings of her family's conspiracy were damaging, but the financial records showing her knowledge of her father's criminal activities were devastating. She'd signed the papers granting Tom full custody of Kyle and walked away with nothing but her car and her clothes. Kyle was thriving. The boy had started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma of his arrest and the revelation of his family's betrayal, but he was resilient. His grades had improved, and he'd made the varsity baseball team. More importantly, he'd stopped looking over his shoulder, stopped waiting for the next betrayal. Tom's construction business had actually benefited from scandal. Being the man who'd exposed police corruption and save his son had given him a certain cachet in the community. New contracts were coming in faster than he could handle them. The only casualty Tom occasionally regretted was Mike Morrison. Linda's brother had tried to stay neutral in the family war, but neutrality was a luxury Tom could no longer afford. When Mike had refused to testify against his father, Tom had made sure that Mike's fire department learned about his brother-in-law's prior knowledge of Ray's activities. Mike had been forced to resign and had left town quietly, probably to start over somewhere else. Tom felt bad about that for approximately 10 minutes. Then he remembered Mike sitting at his dinner table, listening to plans to destroy Kyle, and saying nothing. Family loyalty was a fine thing, but it had to run both ways. On a Tuesday evening in January, Tom and Kyle were working together in the garage, rebuilding the engine of Kyle's Honda. The boy had grown 3 inches since the trial and was finally looking his father in the eye when they talked. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Do you ever miss Mom?" Tom considered the question while cleaning a carburetor. "I miss the woman I thought she was. But that woman probably never existed. Do you think she misses us?" "I think she misses the life we had. But she made her choice." Kyle nodded, accepting this the way he'd learned to accept most hard truths. "Vincent called today. Said Danny Walsh is getting out next month." Tom's hands stilled on the engine part. "Is he planning to cause trouble?" "Vincent doesn't think so. Apparently Danny's got a job lined up in Colorado. Wants to disappear and start over. Smart man." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of tools and quiet classic rock filling the garage. Finally, Kyle spoke again. "I know about Danny being my biological father." Tom looked up. "How long have you known?" "Since the trial. I heard Linda talking to her lawyer." Kyle shrugged. "Doesn't change anything. You're still my dad." Tom smiled, feeling something warm settle in his chest. "Damn right I am. And if anyone tries to take me away from you again..." Tom's smile turned cold. "They'll learn why that's a bad idea." Later that evening, after Kyle had gone to bed, Tom sat in his study reviewing the final reports from Vincent's investigation. Every loose end had been tied up, every enemy neutralized or neutralized. Ray Morrison would die in prison. Danny Walsh would disappear into obscurity. Linda had remarried within 2 months, a middle manager from the next town over who had no idea what kind of woman he'd taken on. Tom's phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello. Mr. Brennan? This is Agent Sarachon with the FBI. I wonder if we could speak." Tom's blood chilled. "About what?" "We're investigating some irregularities in the evidence against the Morrison police corruption case. Some of our forensic accountants have questions about how certain financial records were obtained." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Are you asking if I broke any laws to expose criminals?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to meet with us to discuss your methodology." Tom thought about Ray Morrison in his federal cell, about Danny Walsh planning his escape to Colorado, about Linda starting her new life with a man who would probably be as naive as Tom had once been. "Agent Shun, I think you'll find that everything I did was in defense of my family. And I'd do it all again." "That's what I was afraid you'd say. Are you planning to arrest me?" "That depends on what we find." "Mr. Brennan, some of the methods used in your investigation suggest professional assistance." Tom smiled. "Agent Shun, I'm a construction contractor who built half this town with his own hands. When someone tries to destroy my family, I build something to stop them. And if we find evidence of illegal surveillance or evidence tampering, then you'll have to prove it in court." "And Agent Shun, I've gotten very good at courtroom presentations lately." After hanging up, Tom sat back in his chair and considered his options. The FBI investigation was probably inevitable. Vincent's methods weren't always